Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth, here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. The road leading to the house wasn't on the map. Ellie Harper realized this too late, somewhere around mile marker 47, when her GPS lost signal, and the thick, encroaching fog seemed to swallow the headlights of her aging sedan. The engine hummed a steady rhythm, but even that sound was beginning to fray her nerves. She had been driving for hours through the endless stretch of forest, guided by the promise of a weekend escape. Just her, the open road, and a chance to leave behind the memories she'd been running from. But now, with the creeping darkness pressing against her windows, it felt less like an escape and more like an unintentional descent into something she wasn't prepared to face. It wasn't just the fog. It was the trees, towering pines that seemed unnaturally dense, their twisted limbs clutching at the edges of the road like skeletal fingers. The air smelled damp and metallic, and every so often, she thought she saw movement between the trunks. Something quick, darting in and out of view, just beyond the periphery of her headlights. She shook her head. "Just tired," she muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. The sign appeared suddenly, materializing out of the fog like a specter. Its wooden frame was rotting, the paint chipped, but the words were still legible under her dim high beams. Black Hollow, 12 miles. Relief washed over her. She'd been looking for this turnoff for nearly an hour, convinced she'd missed it. But as she turned onto the narrow dirt road, the unease in her chest only grew. The gravel crunched under her tires, and the forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees almost brushing the sides of her car. Ellie squinted at the path ahead, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. The headlights barely penetrated the oppressive fog, casting eerie shadows that twisted and flickered with each bump in the road. The air seemed thicker here, almost alive, pressing against the car like an unseen weight. She reached over and fiddled with the radio dial, hoping for anything to break the silence, but all she got was static. Sighing, she switched it off. 12 miles, she whispered to herself, as if saying it aloud would make the distance feel shorter. The road wound tighter as it climbed, the forest becoming a labyrinth of gnarled branches and moss-covered trunks. Ellie kept glancing at the clock on the dashboard. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't as if knowing the time would change anything, but the steady passage of minutes felt like a tether to reality. Then, without warning, the car lurched. "Damn it!" Ellie yelped, slamming on the brakes. The engine sputtered and died, leaving her in a suffocating silence broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Her heart pounded as she fumbled for the flashlight in the glove compartment. "Not now, not here," she muttered, stepping out into the cold night air. The fog clung to her like a damp shroud as she circled the car, shining the flashlight on the tires. The right front one had hit a jagged rock, its rubber shredded. Ellie groaned, running a hand through her hair. The spare tire was in the trunk, but she wasn't sure she could change it in this darkness. Still, she had no choice. She opened the trunk and froze. Inside, sitting next to the spare tire, was something she didn't recognize, a small wooden box. It was intricately carved, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in an antique shop, not the trunk of a 30-year-old sedan. Her fingers hovered over it, hesitant. "Where the hell did this come from?" she whispered. Ellie hadn't packed anything like it. She was certain of that. And yet, the box seemed familiar in a way that sent a chill down her spine. Finally, curiosity won out, and she lifted it. The box was heavier than it looked, and the carvings were more intricate up close. They formed patterns, symbols maybe, that seemed to shift when she tilted it in the light. The lid was fastened with a tarnished brass latch. Ellie hesitated again. Her instincts screamed at her to leave it alone, but something deeper, more primal, urged her on. She flipped the latch. The lid creaked open, revealing a tangle of yellowed papers and a faint, acrid smell that made her nose wrinkle. She pulled one of the papers free and unfolded it. The writing was jagged and uneven, scrawled in dark ink that had bled into the brittle surface. At first, it seemed like gibberish, just a series of random letters and numbers. But as Ellie stared at it, the lines seemed to rearrange themselves into a word. "Leave." Her breath caught. The flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, she heard it, a faint, raspy whisper. "Ellie?" She spun around, the flashlight's beam darting across the foggy road. Nothing. Just the skeletal trees and the unrelenting mist. Her hands trembled as she shoved the paper back into the box and slammed the lid shut. She tossed it back into the trunk, her heart hammering in her chest. "Calm down," she whispered. "You're just tired. You're imagining things." But the whisper hadn't sounded imagined. It had sounded real. She grabbed the spare tire and the jack, determined to focus on the task at hand. Kneeling beside the car, she worked quickly, her movements clumsy but deliberate. All the while, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent her heart racing. The flashlight's beam seemed weaker now, the fog devouring its light. And then she saw them. Footprints. They were just a few feet away, pressed into the damp earth. Barefoot, human, and leading into the trees. Ellie froze, the jack slipping from her hand. She stared at the prints, her mind racing. They hadn't been there when she first got out of the car. She was sure of it. Slowly, she rose to her feet, the flashlight shaking in her grip. "Hello," she called, her voice barely more than a whisper. The forest answered with silence. Ellie took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to get in the car and lock the doors. But as she turned, the beam of her flashlight caught something. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was too far to make out clearly, but its outline was unmistakable. Tall, thin, and motionless. "Who's there?" Ellie demanded, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Ellie took another step back, her hand fumbling for the car door. Her fingers found the handle and she yanked it open, diving inside and slamming it shut. She locked the doors and clutched the flashlight like a weapon. The figure was gone. The forest seemed to press closer now, the trees almost leaning over the car. Ellie's breathing was ragged, her pulse pounding in her ears. She turned the key in the ignition, praying the car would start. It didn't. The engine coughed once, then fell silent. "Come on," she pleaded, trying again. Nothing. A soft thud made her jump. It came from the roof of the car. Ellie's breath hitched. She didn't move, didn't even blink. The thud came again, louder this time. And then, from somewhere deep in the woods, she heard it, the whisper. "Ellie?" The whispers didn't stop. "Ellie?" It was faint, like a breath carried on the fog, but it was there, insistent and intimate, as though the voice knew her. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She kept her gaze locked on the dashboard, refusing to look at the mirrors. A louder thud shook the car, this time accompanied by a scraping sound. Metal against metal, slow and deliberate. She reached for her phone in the cup holder, her movements stiff with terror. The screen was dark. No signal. No chance of calling for help. "Think, Ellie. Just think," she muttered under her breath, forcing herself to breathe deeply. The car's interior felt smaller now, claustrophobic, as though the darkness outside was seeping in through the cracks. She dared a glance at the rearview mirror. At first, there was nothing but the swirling fog. But then a shape began to form. A hand, pale and elongated, pressing against the glass. Ellie screamed, throwing herself against the driver's side door. The flashlight tumbled into the footwell, casting erratic beams of light that danced like phantoms across the ceiling. She didn't wait. Fumbling with the door handle, she forced it open and stumbled out into the night. The air was colder now, biting against her skin. The forest was alive with sounds she hadn't noticed before. Crickets chirping, branches creaking, and something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming closer. Ellie spun around, her eyes darting through the fog. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. Silence. The car loomed behind her like a lifeline, but something about it felt wrong now, like it was no longer a safe haven. She couldn't explain it, but the idea of climbing back inside made her stomach churn. The flashlight's beam sputtered as she picked it up, the bulb barely holding on. She swept the light across the ground, following the footprints she had seen earlier. They were clearer now, leading deeper into the woods. "Don't do this," she whispered to herself. But her feet moved anyway, each step a battle against the primal fear clawing at her chest. The trees seemed to grow denser the further she walked, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes that loomed over her like specters. The fog thinned slightly, revealing patches of the forest floor littered with dead leaves and broken twigs. And then she saw it. A cabin barely visible through the gloom. Its roof sagged under the weight of age, and the windows were dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. The front door hung ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed against it. Ellie's instincts screamed at her to turn back, but something about the cabin drew her closer. It felt familiar in a way that made her skin crawl. Her flashlight flickered again and she quickened her pace, desperate to reach the door before the bulb gave out entirely. She stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under her weight. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. The faint outline of furniture was visible in the dim light. A broken chair, a table covered in dust, and a fireplace that hadn't seen flames in decades. Ellie's gaze fell on the walls. They were covered in symbols, the same ones she had seen on the box in her trunk. Crudely drawn, they seemed to pulse in the shadows as though alive. Her hand trembled as she reached for the nearest wall, tracing one of the symbols with her fingertip. It was warm to the touch like freshly drawn ink. The whispers returned. "Ellie?" She spun around, shining the flashlight wildly. The beam landed on a figure standing in the corner, its back turned to her. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't move. Ellie took a hesitant step closer, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear her own thoughts. The figure was tall, with long matted hair that hung down its back like a curtain. Its clothes were tattered, little more than rags clinging to a skeletal frame. "Are you okay?" Ellie asked, her voice shaking. The figure twitched, its head jerking slightly to the side. And then it turned. Its face was wrong, impossibly wrong. The features were warped, as though someone had tried to mold a human face out of wax and failed. The mouth stretched too wide, the eyes were sunken pits, and the skin was pale and translucent, revealing dark veins beneath. Ellie stumbled back, her scream catching in her throat. The figure took a step toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Stay away," she cried, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The figure paused, tilting its head as though considering her words. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed to the fireplace. Ellie's gaze followed the gesture, and her breath hitched. Resting on the hearth was the wooden box. "No," she whispered. "That's impossible. I left it in the car." The figure's mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, and the whispers grew louder, filling the room until they drowned out everything else. "Ellie?" Her vision blurred, the symbols on the walls glowing brighter and brighter until the entire room was bathed in an eerie red light. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on a loose floorboard. The last thing she saw before she hit the ground was the figure lunging toward her, its distorted face filling her vision. Ellie jolted awake, gasping for air. She was back in her car, the engine idling softly. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, and the fog outside was as thick as ever. She looked around, disoriented. The flashlight was back in the glove compartment, and the wooden box was gone. Had she imagined it? A nightmare brought on by exhaustion? But then she noticed the symbols. They were etched into the inside of her windshield, faint but unmistakable. And in the distance, just beyond the reach of her headlights, the cabin stood waiting. Ellie sat frozen in the car, her breath fogging the windshield. The symbols stared back at her, faint and sinister, as though they had grown there organically. She touched one of them cautiously, half expecting it to burn her skin, but it was cold and smooth like frost. The whispers had gone silent, but the stillness in their absence was worse. The cabin loomed in the distance, shrouded in fog, daring her to return. Her first instinct was to flee, to put as much distance between herself and this place as possible. She twisted the key in the ignition, but the car responded with a grinding noise, then fell silent. "Not now," she muttered, trying again. The engine sputtered but refused to turn over. Her phone was still dead, the black screen mocking her. For the first time, Ellie felt truly trapped. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "Think. Just think." Her eyes drifted back to the cabin. Every fiber of her being told her to stay away, but a nagging thought wormed its way into her mind. The box was in there. Somehow, it had moved from her trunk to the hearth, and she needed to know why. Ellie grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, praying it would hold out. The beam was faint, flickering at the edges, but it was better than nothing. She stepped out of the car, the cold night air wrapping around her like a shroud. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual night sounds conspicuously absent. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, leaving only the crunch of Ellie's footsteps as she made her way back toward the cabin. The door was still ajar, creaking softly in the non-existent breeze. Ellie hesitated on the threshold, the flashlight trembling in her hand. Inside, the cabin was exactly as she remembered it, dusty, decayed, and suffused with an air of wrongness. The symbols on the walls pulsed faintly, their glow dim but alive. And there it was, The wooden box sat on the hearth, exactly where she had seen it before. It looked untouched, its surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. Ellie approached it cautiously, her heart pounding. She knelt in front of it, running her fingers along the edges. The carvings were intricate, the symbols etched so deeply they seemed to pierce the wood. "What are you?" she whispered. The whispers returned, faint and indistinct, like a distant chorus. She hesitated, then lifted the lid. The box was empty. For a moment, Ellie felt a strange sense of relief. But then, as she stared into its depths, a feeling of vertigo washed over her. It was as if the inside of the box stretched endlessly, a dark void that pulled at her very soul. She snapped the lid shut, breathing hard. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a storm. "Ellie?" She spun around, shining the flashlight into the shadows. The figure was back, standing in the corner where she had first seen it. "Leave me alone," she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin. The figure didn't move. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the fireplace. Ellie followed its gaze and froze. A photograph had appeared on the mantel. It was old, the edges yellowed with age. She stepped closer, her stomach churning as she recognized the faces in the picture. It was her family. Her mother and father stood side by side, smiling stiffly at the camera. And there, in the center, was Ellie as a child, clutching the same wooden box in her tiny hands. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible." Memories she had long buried began to resurface. Her parents arguing late at night, the strange rituals her mother performed in the basement, and the whispers that had plagued her as a child. "This isn't real," she said, backing away. "It's not real." The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Ellie's flashlight flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, the figure seemed to teleport, appearing inches away when the light returned. Panicking, Ellie bolted for the door, slamming it behind her as she stumbled out into the night. She didn't stop running until she reached the car, her lungs burning and her legs trembling. She yanked the driver's side door open and collapsed into the seat, locking the doors behind her. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the keys as she tried the ignition again. This time the engine roared to life. "Thank God," she breathed, throwing the car into reverse. But as she backed up, her headlights illuminated something in the distance. The cabin was gone. In its place stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The symbols from the cabin were carved into its bark, glowing faintly in the darkness. Ellie stared in disbelief, her mind racing. How could an entire building disappear? A sudden noise drew her attention, a loud, rhythmic thudding coming from the roof of the car. She froze, her heart pounding. Slowly, she reached for the flashlight, her movements deliberate and cautious. The thudding continued, each impact shaking the car slightly. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ellie opened the door and stepped out. She shone the flashlight upward, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was perched on the roof, its grotesque face twisted into a mockery of a smile. It clutched the wooden box in its spindly hands, holding it out toward her like an offering. "No," Ellie whispered, backing away. "Leave me alone." The figure tilted its head, the smile widening. And then, in one fluid motion, it dropped the box at her feet and disappeared into the night. Ellie stared at the box, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She didn't want to touch it, but she knew she couldn't leave it behind. With trembling hands, she picked it up. The wood felt warm, almost alive, and the symbols glowed faintly under her touch. She climbed back into the car, placing the box on the passenger seat. As she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The whispers had stopped, but the silence felt heavier now, as though something unseen was lurking just out of sight. In the rearview mirror, the tree stood tall, its glowing symbols growing fainter as she put distance between herself and the forest. But Ellie knew it wasn't over. The box was with her now, and whatever it carried wasn't going to let her go. Ellie drove aimlessly, her eyes darting between the road ahead and the wooden box sitting on the passenger seat. The further she got from the forest, the more the oppressive silence pressed against her ears. It was as if the night itself had swallowed all sound, leaving only the faint hum of the car engine. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. The symbols on the box seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness, casting an eerie glow that illuminated her face. She had no idea where she was going, only that she couldn't stop. Something about the box demanded movement, as though staying still would give it time to root itself deeper into her life. "What do you want from me?" she muttered, glancing at the box. The whispering started again, faint and indistinct. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, slipping into her ears like smoke. Ellie slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the desolate road. She stared at the box, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "You're not real," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't happening." But the box pulsed again, its glow intensifying. "Open it." The voice was clear this time, a low, raspy command that sent shivers down her spine. Ellie turned her head sharply, expecting to see someone sitting in the back seat, but the car was empty. "Open it," the voice repeated, louder this time. Ellie reached out with trembling hands, her fingers brushing the lid. The wood felt warm, almost like flesh, and she recoiled instinctively. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not playing your game." The box didn't respond, but the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of disjointed voices that filled the car. Ellie threw the door open and stumbled out into the cold night air, her chest heaving. She leaned against the car, trying to steady herself, but the voices followed her, swirling around her like a swarm of bees. In the distance, she saw a faint light, a gas station, its fluorescent glow a beacon in the darkness. Without thinking, she grabbed the box and started walking toward it, the gravel crunching under her boots. As she approached, the gas station came into clearer view. It was old and run down, with flickering neon signs and a single car parked by the pumps. The place looked abandoned, but Ellie didn't care. She just needed to be around something, anything, that felt normal. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside, the sound startling in the stillness. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing in the empty space. Shelves lined with dusty cans and faded labels greeted her. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the flickering overhead lights cast long, unsettling shadows. Ellie set the box on the counter and leaned over, peering into the back room. "Is anyone here?" A low creak answered her, and she spun around, heart pounding. One of the shelves had shifted slightly, its contents rattling. "Hello," she called again, her voice shaking. The whispers returned, louder now, and Ellie realized they were coming from the box. She stared at it, her stomach churning. The lid shifted, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to send her heart racing. "Don't," a voice whispered behind her. Ellie whipped around, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. A man stood at the far end of the store, his face half hidden in the shadows. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes ragged and stained. "Don't open it," he said again, stepping closer. Ellie backed away, her hand instinctively reaching for the box. "Who are you?" The man stopped, his eyes locking onto hers. They were bloodshot, the whites tinged with yellow, and his expression was one of pure desperation. "You don't know what you found," he said, his voice hoarse. "That thing, it's not meant to be here." Ellie swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "What is it?" The man hesitated, glancing nervously at the box. "It's a door," he said finally. "A door to something that should never be let out." Ellie's blood ran cold. "What does that mean?" The man shook his head. "You wouldn't understand. Just leave it here. Walk away and don't look back." Ellie stared at him, her mind racing. She wanted to believe him, to leave the box behind and forget any of this had ever happened. But something deep inside her wouldn't let her. "I can't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's face twisted into a mask of anger and fear. "You don't have a choice. If you keep it, it'll take everything from you. Your mind, your soul, everything." The box began to hum, a low vibration that rattled the counter. Ellie turned toward it, her breath catching in her throat. The lid was lifting on its own. "Stop," the man shouted, lunging forward. But it was too late. The lid snapped open, and a burst of light filled the room, blinding and cold. Ellie stumbled back, shielding her eyes as the whispers turned into screams. When the light faded, the man was gone. The box sat silently on the counter, its symbols dim and lifeless. Ellie approached it cautiously, her heart pounding. She half expected something to leap out at her, but the box remained still. Inside there was something new, a small, folded piece of paper. With trembling hands, Ellie reached for it, unfolding it carefully. The paper was old and yellowed, the edges frayed. Written in spidery handwriting were 3 words. "You are next." Ellie's breath hitched, and she dropped the paper as though it had burned her. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. The gas station felt suddenly oppressive, the air thick and heavy. She grabbed the box and ran for the door, the bell jingling behind her as she burst outside. The night was darker than before, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. Ellie climbed into her car and slammed the door, locking it behind her. She glanced at the box sitting on the passenger seat, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. The box didn't answer, but in the rearview mirror, Ellie saw something that made her blood run cold. The man from the gas station was standing in the road behind her, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And he was smiling. Ellie's foot slammed down on the gas pedal, the tires squealing as her car shot forward into the night. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the rearview mirror. The man's glowing eyes followed her, unblinking, his silhouette growing fainter as the distance between them stretched. Her chest heaved as she fought to calm her breathing. The road ahead was a black ribbon cutting through the endless dark, illuminated only by the thin beams of her headlights. The box sat silently on the passenger seat, its presence heavy and unnerving. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, waiting. The paper with the ominous message, ***, you are next ***, had vanished. Ellie glanced at the box, her stomach twisting. She needed answers. The man's cryptic warning echoed in her mind. ***, it's a door. A door to what? Her grip tightened on the wheel as she scanned the horizon for a sign of civilization, something to anchor her back to reality. The forest had long since receded, replaced by empty fields and scattered clusters of skeletal trees. Then, in the distance, she saw it, a house. The structure loomed at the end of a long dirt driveway, its windows glowing faintly like eyes in the dark. It was old and weather-beaten, the kind of place that seemed to exist outside of time. Ellie hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to keep driving, but the pull of the box was undeniable. She turned onto the driveway, the car jostling over the uneven terrain. The house grew larger as she approached, its features sharpening in the dim light. The porch sagged under the weight of years, and the shutters hung crookedly, as if the building itself were slouching in exhaustion. She parked the car and sat for a moment, her hands trembling on the wheel. The whispers had returned, faint but persistent, weaving through her thoughts like a sinister melody. Ellie grabbed the box and stepped out into the night. The air was colder here, biting at her skin, and the silence was so complete it felt like a physical weight. The door to the house creaked open before she even reached it. Ellie froze, her pulse racing. "Hello?" There was no answer. Clutching the box tightly, she stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single oil lamp sitting on a rickety table in the center of the room. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. "Is someone here?" she called out. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, and Ellie spun around, her heart hammering. But the room was empty. "Ellie?" The voice was a whisper, soft and intimate, as if it had been spoken directly into her ear. She whirled again, but there was still no one there. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The whisper came again, this time from the box in her hands. "Ellie, you shouldn't have come." She nearly dropped it, her knees buckling under the weight of her fear. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice echoing through the empty house. But the box only pulsed in response, its symbols glowing faintly. The door behind her slammed shut, and Ellie spun around, panic rising in her chest. She ran to it and yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out," she cried, pounding on the wood. The whispers grew louder, filling the room like a storm. Ellie stumbled back, her hands clutching her ears. The walls seemed to close in, the wallpaper curling and blackening as if burned by an unseen flame. The air grew thick, choking her with its weight. "Why are you doing this?" she screamed. The box answered, its voice low and menacing. "You opened the door." "What door?" "I don't understand." The shadows in the room began to shift, coalescing into a figure at the far end. It was tall and featureless, its body a mass of swirling darkness. Ellie backed away, her hands trembling. "Stay away from me." The shadow moved closer, its presence filling the room with an unbearable cold. "You are the key," it said, its voice a chorus of overlapping whispers. "And the door must remain open." Ellie's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the words. The box had done this, brought her here, trapped her in this nightmare. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it reached out with a tendril of darkness, curling around the box in her hands. Ellie screamed as the tendril tightened, pulling at the box with an unnatural force. "No," she cried, holding on to it with all her strength. The room spun around her, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. The walls dissolved into darkness, and Ellie felt herself falling, the ground vanishing beneath her feet. She landed hard on cold, damp earth, the impact knocking the wind out of her. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the house. She was back in the forest. The box lay a few feet away, its glow dim and flickering. Ellie crawled toward it, her body aching. "Ellie?" The voice was louder now, coming from all directions. She looked up and saw them, figures emerging from the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were the same as the man from the gas station, their faces gaunt and pale, their movements slow and deliberate. "You are next," they said in unison, their voices echoing in the stillness. Ellie grabbed the box and stumbled to her feet, her mind screaming for her to run. But as she turned to flee, she realized something horrifying. The forest was endless, stretching out in every direction. And no matter which way she ran, the figures would always be waiting. Ellie bolted through the endless forest, the box clutched tightly in her hands. Her breaths came in sharp, ragged gasps, her heart pounding as though it might burst from her chest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at her hair and clothes as she stumbled through the darkness. The glowing-eyed figures followed her, their movements slow but relentless, their presence oppressive. Their whispers filled the air, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. "You can't run, Ellie," they murmured, their voices overlapping in a sinister harmony. "It's already too late." Ellie ignored them, forcing herself to keep moving. She had no idea where she was going. Every direction looked the same, a labyrinth of shadows and twisted trunks, but she knew she couldn't stop. The box pulsed in her arms, its glow dim but steady. She hated it, but she couldn't bring herself to let it go. It felt like the only anchor she had in this nightmare, the only thing tethering her to reality. The ground beneath her feet grew uneven, roots and rocks jutting out like traps. Ellie stumbled, falling hard onto her knees. Pain shot through her legs, but she scrambled to her feet, driven by the whispers growing louder behind her. "You've seen it now," they hissed. "You can't escape." Tears streamed down her face as she ran, her vision blurred and her body screaming in protest. She didn't know how much longer she could keep going. And then she saw it, a light, faint and flickering in the distance. Hope surged in her chest and she sprinted toward it, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The light grew brighter as she approached, revealing a clearing in the forest. In the center of the clearing stood an old well, its stones crumbling and covered in moss. A lantern hung from a rusted hook on the side, its flame casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. Ellie skidded to a stop, her chest heaving. The clearing was silent, the oppressive whispers momentarily gone. She approached the well cautiously, her instinct screaming that this was a trap. The lantern's flame danced in the breeze, casting strange, shifting patterns on the stones. The box pulsed in her hands, its glow intensifying. Ellie hesitated, then placed the box on the edge of the well. She didn't know why, but it felt right, like this was where it was meant to be. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic. The glowing-eyed figures emerged from the forest, their movements quicker now, more urgent. "You can't do this," they said, their voices rising in a crescendo. "The door must stay open." Ellie ignored them, her hands trembling as she opened the box. Inside was a key, ancient and rusted, its surface engraved with strange symbols. The whispers turned into screams, the figures closing in around her. The air grew thick and heavy, the ground beneath her feet trembling. Ellie grabbed the key and turned to face the well. It was deeper than she had imagined, its depths swallowed by darkness. But she could feel something down there, something waiting. Her hands shook as she lowered the key toward the lock embedded in the stone. "No," the figures cried, their voices desperate. "You don't know what you're doing." Ellie hesitated, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know what would happen if she turned the key, but she was tired of running, tired of being afraid. With a deep breath, she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The ground shook violently and a deafening roar filled the air. The figures screamed, their bodies dissolving into shadow as the well erupted with light. Ellie shielded her eyes, the brightness blinding. The box vibrated violently, then shattered into pieces, the fragments disappearing into the air. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. The glowing-eyed figures were gone, and the forest seemed different. The oppressive weight had lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. Ellie collapsed to her knees, her body trembling. The key was gone, and the well looked like any ordinary well, old and abandoned. But something wasn't right. The forest was too quiet, too still. And in the back of her mind, Ellie could still hear the faintest whisper. "You've opened it," the voice said, soft and sinister. "And now it begins?" Ellie didn't realize she was screaming until her throat was raw and burning. The clearing was empty now, devoid of the shadowed figures that had chased her through the forest, yet their absence brought no relief. Instead, an overwhelming silence settled around her, thick and impenetrable, as though the world had taken a collective breath and forgotten to exhale. She clutched her chest, trying to steady the wild thumping of her heart. The key was gone, the box reduced to scattered fragments that had vanished into the ether. The well looked unchanged, its moss-covered stones quietly absorbing the moonlight. Yet Ellie knew something fundamental had shifted. The forest felt alive. Ellie stood shakily, her legs quivering beneath her. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the treeline for any signs of movement. The lantern hanging on the side of the well still burned, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching toward her like grasping fingers. A cold wind blew through the clearing, carrying with it a sound, a faint, rhythmic hum. It was almost imperceptible at first, blending into the background noise of rustling leaves and creaking branches. But as Ellie strained to listen, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a melody. No, not a melody, a chant. Her skin prickled as the chant grew louder, resonating in the still air. The voices were high and ethereal, blending together in perfect harmony. They seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere all at once, surrounding her, enclosing her. Ellie backed away from the well, her breath hitching in her throat. The chant wasn't just a sound, it was a presence. She could feel it pressing against her skin, slipping into her ears, her mind, her very soul. "Stop," she whispered, clutching her head as the voices grew deafening. "Please stop." But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, the harmony shifting into a discordant wail that made her teeth ache. Ellie stumbled backward, her vision blurring as the world tilted around her. Then she saw them. Figures began to emerge from the forest, their movements eerily synchronized with the chant. They were cloaked in tattered robes, their faces obscured by deep hoods. Their hands, pale and skeletal, clutched ancient instruments, harps, flutes, drums, that seemed to play themselves. Ellie froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The figures moved in a slow, deliberate procession, their steps perfectly timed to the rhythm of the chant. Their presence was overwhelming, their very existence a violation of the natural order. She wanted to run, but her body refused to move. Her legs felt rooted to the ground, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. She could only watch as the figures drew closer, their chant rising to a fever pitch. The first figure stopped mere feet from her. Its hooded head tilted slightly as though studying her. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as the figure extended a hand, its bony fingers pointing toward the well. The chant ceased abruptly, the sudden silence more jarring than the noise. Ellie swallowed hard, her throat dry. What do you want?" she whispered. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached into its robe and pulled out a small object. It was a mirror, its surface cracked and blackened with age. The figure held it out to her, its skeletal hand trembling slightly. Ellie hesitated, then reached out to take the mirror. The moment her fingers touched its surface, a searing pain shot through her arm. She cried out, dropping the mirror to the ground. The mirror didn't shatter. Instead, it began to glow, its surface swirling with dark, viscous liquid. The liquid oozed out of the mirror, pooling on the ground and forming a shape, a face. Ellie recoiled as the face took shape, its features grotesque and distorted. Its eyes were empty sockets, its mouth a gaping void that seemed to suck in the light around it. "You open the door," the face said, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "You must pay the price." Ellie shook her head, backing away. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The face snarled, its features contorting in rage. "Ignorance is no excuse. The well is awake. The choir sings for you now." The figures around her began to move again, their chant resuming in a low, haunting tone. The face sank back into the pool of liquid, which began to spread, creeping toward Ellie like a living thing. She turned and ran, her feet slipping on the damp ground. The chant followed her, growing louder and more frenzied with every step. She didn't dare look back, her focus solely on escaping the nightmare closing in around her. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees blending into one another in a disorienting blur. Ellie's breaths came in short, panicked gasps, her lungs burning as she pushed herself to keep moving. Then she saw it, a faint light in the distance. Her heart leapt with hope, and she sprinted toward it, the chant fading slightly as she put distance between herself and the clearing. The light grew brighter, revealing a small cabin nestled among the trees. Ellie burst through the door, slamming it shut behind her. She leaned against it, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The cabin was dark and musty, its air thick with the scent of decay. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the floorboards creaked beneath her weight. Ellie grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, her hands trembling. She didn't know if it would hold, but it was better than nothing. She turned to survey the room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. A single candle burned on a table in the center of the room, its flame flickering as though threatened by an unseen breeze. On the table sat a book, its cover worn and faded. Ellie approached it cautiously, her instincts screaming at her to leave it alone. But something about the book drew her in, an inexplicable pull she couldn't resist. She opened it, her fingers brushing against the brittle pages. The text was written in an unfamiliar language, its symbols strange and unsettling. But as she stared at the words, they began to shift, rearranging themselves into something she could understand. The book told the story of the well, of its origins, its purpose, and the choir that served it. It spoke of a terrible hunger, an insatiable force that demanded sacrifice. Ellie's hands shook as she read, the truth sinking in. The well wasn't just a gateway, it was a prison, and she had set something free. A sudden crash jolted her from her thoughts. The door rattled violently, the chair wedged beneath it straining against the force. The chant returned, louder and more frenzied than ever. Ellie clutched the book to her chest, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't stay here. The door splintered, the wood cracking under the relentless assault. Ellie backed away, her eyes darting around the room for an escape. There, a window. She ran to it, throwing it open and climbing out just as the door gave way. The chant swelled, filling the air with its oppressive melody as Ellie fled into the night. The forest closed in around her, the trees whispering secrets she couldn't understand. The book burned in her hands, its warmth both a comfort and a curse. And in the distance, the choir sang on, their song a promise of the horrors yet to come. Ellie's breaths came in shallow, panicked gasps as she sprinted through the oppressive forest. The twisted branches above seemed to claw at her, reaching for her hair and clothes as though alive. The book in her hands felt heavier with each step, its leather cover radiating unnatural warmth. The chant had faded to a low hum behind her, but it was still there, haunting and persistent. She dared not slow down even as her legs burned and her chest heaved with the effort. The faint light of dawn teased the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. Ellie stumbled into another clearing, smaller than the one before. The space was dominated by a gnarled oak tree, its roots twisting and spiraling outward like frozen snakes. She collapsed at its base, her body trembling with exhaustion. The book thudded onto the ground beside her, its pages fluttering open as though beckoning her to read more. Ellie pushed it away, her hand trembling. "Leave me alone," she whispered, her voice breaking. But the book didn't respond. Instead, the chant grew louder, as if mocking her plea. Ellie buried her face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had no idea how to escape this nightmare, no idea how to undo what she had unleashed. All she wanted was to leave this cursed place and never look back. The sound of snapping twigs pulled her from her despair. Ellie's head shot up, her heart racing as she scanned the tree-line. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. She stood, her hands clenching into fists. "I said, who's there?" The shadows moved. At first, she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, but the movement was deliberate, calculated. Shapes emerged from the darkness, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. Ellie backed against the tree, her nails digging into the rough bark. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice cracking. The figures ignored her warning, continuing their slow, methodical approach. As they stepped into the clearing, Ellie's stomach churned. Their faces were hers. Each figure was a distorted reflection of herself, some with empty eyes, others with mouths stretched into unnatural grins. Their bodies were wrong, their limbs too long or bending at impossible angles. One stepped closer, its hollow gaze fixed on her. "Ellie," it said, its voice a grotesque echo of her own. "Why do you run from us?" I don't know what you want," Ellie stammered, pressing herself harder against the tree. Another figure spoke, its tone dripping with malice. "You opened the door. You freed the well. Now you must pay the price." The chant swelled again, this time coming from the figures themselves. Their mouths moved in perfect synchronization, the melody rising and falling like waves crashing against the shore. Ellie's head throbbed as the sound burrowed into her mind, twisting her thoughts into a tangled mess of fear and confusion. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it was no use. The chant was inside her. "No," she screamed, her voice raw. "Leave me alone." The figures paused, their heads tilting in unison. Then, as one, they pointed to the book lying at her feet. Ellie hesitated, her breath hitching in her throat. She didn't want to touch it, didn't want to read another word of its cursed text. But the figures didn't move, their silent demand clear. With trembling hands, she picked up the book. The pages flipped on their own, stopping on an illustration that sent a chill down her spine. It was the well. But the image was alive, its surface rippling as though made of water. Shapes moved within it, faces, hands, creatures too horrible to describe. The words below the image shifted, forming a single command: "Return to the source." Ellie shook her head, slamming the book shut. "No, I'm not going back there." The figures stepped closer, their chant rising to a deafening crescendo. "Return to the source," they intoned, their voices merging into one. "Return or be consumed." Ellie's legs buckled, and she sank to the ground, the weight of their presence crushing her. She knew she had no choice. The well had claimed her, and it wouldn't rest until she obeyed. "I'll go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Just stop." The chant ceased instantly, the silence more oppressive than the noise. The figures stared at her for a long moment, their hollow eyes unblinking. Then, one by one, they dissolved into shadows, melting back into the forest. Ellie sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. The book rested in her lap, its cover pulsating faintly like a beating heart. Finally, she stood, her legs trembling beneath her. She clutched the book tightly, its weight a constant reminder of the burden she carried. The journey back to the well was agonizingly slow. The forest seemed to shift around her, the trees whispering and creaking as if alive. The air grew colder with each step, her breath forming clouds that hung in the still air. When she finally reached the clearing, her heart sank. The well looked different now, larger, darker, more menacing. The lantern that had hung beside it was gone, replaced by a pulsating red light that seemed to emanate from within the well itself. Ellie approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at her to run. She placed the book on the edge of the well, its pages flipping open to the same illustration. "Now what?" she muttered, her voice shaking. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble. A low, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the well, growing louder and more insistent. Ellie stumbled backward, her eyes widening in terror. The shadows emerged again, but this time they weren't human. They slithered out of the well, their forms constantly shifting and writhing. Ellie screamed, falling to her knees as the shadows closed in around her. The book began to glow, its light burning brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The forest was silent. The well was dark. The book lay closed at her feet, its surface scorched and smoking. Ellie sat there, trembling and gasping for air. She didn't understand what had just happened, but one thing was clear: the well wasn't done with her yet. In the distance, the chant began anew, faint and haunting. And Ellie knew she would never truly escape. Ellie stumbled away from the well, her body heavy with a strange, unshakable dread. The forest had gone completely still, as if it too were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The shadows had receded, but their presence lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Her eyes darted around, trying to focus on something, anything familiar, but the trees were warped, their trunks twisted into grotesque shapes that seemed to bend toward her. The sky above was a sickly shade of gray, a color that seemed unnatural even for twilight. Ellie's chest tightened as the faintest whisper of the chant reached her ears once more. The words were soft, almost too faint to hear, but they clawed at her insides like a gnawing itch that refused to be scratched. "Stop it," she whispered, pressing her hands over her ears, but the sound only grew louder, echoing in her mind as much as in the air around her. "Return to the source." She clenched her jaw, forcing her legs to move. She had to get out of the forest. She had to leave this cursed place, but no matter how fast she ran, the oppressive weight of the place seemed to follow her, an invisible force pulling her back. The trees parted ahead, revealing a narrow, twisted path. Ellie froze. She hadn't seen this trail before, and yet something deep inside her recognized it, pulling her forward with a compulsion she couldn't resist. With a shaking breath, she stepped onto the path, her footsteps crunching softly against the brittle leaves beneath her. The chanting had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was worse, like the calm before a storm. The path seemed endless, winding through the trees in a never-ending loop. "Where am I?" she whispered aloud, her voice trembling in the dead air. She glanced behind her, but the path had already disappeared. The trees closed in, blocking any escape, and a chill swept over her, making her skin prickle. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed her whole, leaving her no choice but to keep walking forward. The further she went, the more the trees seemed to change, their bark peeling and their limbs stretching out like twisted fingers. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through her bones. And then she saw it. The clearing ahead was bathed in an eerie, unnatural light, a soft glow that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The trees around the clearing were dead, their skeletal branches reaching out toward the center, as if in worship. At the center of the clearing stood a stone pillar, ancient and worn with age. A symbol was carved into its surface, one she had seen before. The same symbol that had been on the book. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She wanted to turn and run, but her body refused to obey. She was drawn to the pillar, as though some unseen force was urging her forward. She stepped into the clearing, the air thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to weigh down on her every breath. The symbol on the stone glowed faintly, pulsating with an otherworldly rhythm, and as she got closer, Ellie could hear a low, guttural voice calling her name. Her knees buckled as she approached, the voice growing louder with each step. It was as if the earth itself was speaking to her, urging her to come closer, to embrace whatever lay at the center of the symbol. "Ellie," the voice was soft, sweet, but there was something terrifying about it. It was the same voice she had heard in her dreams, in the depths of her nightmares. The voice of the entity. "No," she gasped, backing away, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "No, I won't do it." But the voice wasn't listening. It continued, louder now, insistent. "Come, Ellie. Come to the source. You can't escape what you've awakened." A cold hand gripped her shoulder. Ellie froze, her entire body going rigid with terror. She didn't have to look to know what it was. The shadows were here again, clinging to her like a shroud. The figures, those twisted reflections of herself, were standing behind her, their hollow eyes fixed on her with an almost predatory gaze. The first one spoke, its voice a rasping whisper. "You think you can escape us? You think you can undo what you've done?" Ellie turned, her heart racing, and her eyes locked on the face of the figure. It was her face, but wrong. The eyes were hollow, the mouth twisted in a grotesque grin. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just want to go home." The figure tilted its head, the smile growing wider. "There is no home for you anymore, Ellie. You belong to the source now." The earth beneath her feet trembled, and the ground around the stone pillar began to crack. The symbol on the pillar flared to life, the light now blinding, and the chanting began anew, louder and more frantic. Ellie stumbled back, her mind spinning. She couldn't escape this. She couldn't escape them. The shadows moved in closer, and Ellie felt their cold presence surround her. She raised her hands as if trying to ward them off, but it was no use. Their touch was cold, suffocating, like they were pulling her into the earth itself. And then the voice returned, louder than ever before, echoing in her mind. "Ellie, come to the source." The ground beneath her cracked wide open, revealing a dark, gaping void, the bottom lost in shadow. Ellie screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the chant. And then, silence. Ellie's eyes shot open, but it wasn't the familiar warmth of daylight that greeted her. It was a crushing, suffocating blackness that wrapped around her like a cloak. Her body ached as if she'd been battered by unseen forces, and she realized, too late, that she was falling. Her stomach lurched with vertigo, the sensation of weightlessness terrifying in its intensity. Panic surged through her, and she reached out, grasping for something solid. There was nothing. Her hands sliced through the air, brushing against nothing but emptiness. Her heart pounded in her chest, the echo of its rhythm blending with the silent void around her. She couldn't tell how far she had fallen, how deep the darkness went. It was as if the world itself had swallowed her whole, leaving her suspended in the inky abyss. No. No, she screamed, her voice a hollow, distant thing that didn't even seem to belong to her. The fear was raw and suffocating, thickening in the air around her. She was certain she would never hit the ground, that this falling would never end. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation of falling ceased. The weightlessness vanished, and Ellie found herself slamming onto the cold, unforgiving surface of stone. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, leaving her gasping for air as her body shuddered from the shock. Her hands scraped against the hard surface beneath her, trying to push herself up, but it was no use. She could barely move, too disoriented to regain control. Slowly, she forced herself to her knees, her skin slick with sweat, her breath ragged in her chest. The air around her was thick and musty, damp with the scent of decay. It was the same air she had breathed in the clearing, the same oppressive atmosphere that seemed to weigh down on everything it touched. Ellie wiped the sweat from her brow, her eyes darting around in an attempt to make sense of her surroundings. She was no longer in the forest. There was no sign of the twisted trees or the faint glow of the clearing. Instead, she was in a cavern. The walls were jagged, slick with moisture, and they stretched high above her, disappearing into the impenetrable blackness. The floor beneath her was uneven, covered in patches of moss and ancient stone. The only light came from a faint, otherworldly glow that seemed to emanate from deep within the cavern itself, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. Ellie's breath hitched in her throat as she stood, the sound of her footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. The cavern felt endless, the kind of place where even the bravest souls could get lost and never find their way out. But that wasn't the worst of it. As she took a tentative step forward, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Not her own. Ellie froze, her blood turning to ice. The footsteps were behind her, moving in time with her own, but when she spun around, there was nothing. No one. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and she could feel the panic rising again, creeping up her spine like a living thing. She couldn't stay here. She had to find a way out. But as she moved deeper into the cavern, the footsteps followed. They were faint at first, then growing louder with each step she took, until it felt as though they were closing in on her from all sides. "Who's there?" Ellie called, her voice shaking with fear, but the only response was the echo of her own words. She gritted her teeth and forced herself forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The deeper she went into the cavern, the more oppressive the air became, as if the very stone was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. And then, through the darkness, she saw it. A shape. A figure. It was standing at the far end of the cavern, its silhouette barely visible in the dim glow. Ellie's heart stopped, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to make out its features. But it was no use. The figure was too far, too obscured by the shadows to be seen clearly. It moved, its steps soundless, and Ellie stumbled back in terror. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice rising with desperation. But the figure didn't respond. It simply moved closer, its movements almost unnatural, like something too fluid, too smooth to be human. With a burst of adrenaline, Ellie turned and ran. She couldn't see where she was going, the cavern twisting and turning, but she didn't care. The figure was following her now, its presence growing closer with each heartbeat. Ellie's breath came in ragged gasps as she dashed through the dark, her mind screaming for an escape. Her foot caught on something and she fell hard against the stone floor, the impact jarring her bones. Pain shot up her arms as she pushed herself back to her feet, but there was no time to recover. The figure was getting closer. She could hear its steps now, heavy, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. It was almost upon her. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with thoughts of what it could be, who it could be. But when she dared a glance over her shoulder, she saw nothing. The figure had vanished. Ellie's chest heaved with panic as she slowed to a stop, her mind unable to process what had just happened. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air had thickened, the shadows closing in on her from all sides. And then she heard it. A whisper. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. Return? The whisper slithered through her mind like a cold serpent, its meaning twisting and warping her thoughts. She closed her eyes, trying to shake the words from her head. But they stayed. And as the whisper grew louder, Ellie realized, whatever it wasn't letting her leave. Ellie stood frozen in place, her heart pounding so loudly she feared the echoes would betray her. The whisper still lingered in her mind, like an insidious presence, coiling tighter and tighter around her thoughts. Return? It wasn't a plea, it was a command. A part of her wanted to turn and run, to ignore the whisper and escape the cavern, but the other part, the part that had started to unravel, felt its grip on her tighten. It was as if the very air around her was pressing in, urging her toward something deep within the cavern's heart. She shuddered and took a step back, but the darkness felt suffocating now, as if the shadows themselves were closing in on her. The cavern had changed, had twisted since she'd first entered. It was no longer simply a place of eerie quiet. It had become alive, hostile, alive with purpose. Return, the whisper came again, and this time, Ellie could almost feel the words brushing against her skin, like cold fingers tracing her spine. She had no choice but to listen. With a reluctant, heavy breath, Ellie began to move. Her feet felt unsteady, almost as if the stone under her was shifting, refusing to give her solid ground. The whisper continued, insistent now, guiding her forward. It wasn't long before she saw them. The symbols. Carved into the walls, hidden deep within the folds of the cavern, she noticed strange markings, scratches, gouges in the rock, symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse in the dim light. They were ancient, primal, but somehow they felt familiar, as if they belonged to a place buried in her memory. Ellie's fingers brushed against one of them, and a shiver ran down her spine. There was a strange warmth to the rock beneath her touch, almost as though the markings themselves were alive. Her mind spun with fragments of thoughts, fragments of memories that weren't hers, visions of faces twisted in agony, of things that lurked just beyond the edges of her vision. And then it hit her. The cavern, the symbols, they weren't just relics of an ancient past. They were a map to the heart of something far worse. But worse still, the symbols weren't just symbols. They were a warning, and Ellie was moving toward them. As she continued deeper into the labyrinthine tunnels, the air grew colder, thicker, until it felt like the very life was being sucked from her lungs. The light from the distant glow ahead flickered like a dying flame. But Ellie kept walking. She couldn't stop now. Something was pulling her forward, something she couldn't fight, couldn't resist. She was losing herself to it. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening now. Her thoughts were drowned by it, her own voice silenced by the relentless call. Return? Her breath caught in her throat as she turned a corner and found herself standing before a massive stone archway, towering and ominous. The symbols were all around it, etched into the very framework of the stone, radiating an eerie, sickly glow. At the top of the arch there was one symbol, different from the rest. It was larger, more intricate, and it pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to beat in time with her own heart. Ellie felt drawn to it, her feet moving toward it before she could even think to stop herself. A heavy sense of dread filled her chest. She wanted to turn away, to run in the opposite direction, but the pull was too strong. She had to know. With shaking hands, she reached out to touch the stone above the arch. The moment her fingers brushed against it, a shock of cold shot through her body, like a bolt of electricity. The ground trembled beneath her, and the very walls of the cavern seemed to shift and groan, as if awakening from a long slumber. The whisper became a chant, low, guttural, in a language she couldn't understand, but it felt familiar all the same. And then she heard it. A voice, clear, strong. Ellie? Her name, spoken softly but with terrifying finality. She froze, the chill seeping deeper into her bones as she turned around, her pulse hammering in her throat. Standing in the shadows, barely visible, was a figure she knew all too well. It was her mother. Her face, pale and cold as death, stared back at her, her eyes wide and unblinking. The figure moved closer, and Ellie's breath caught in her throat. "Mom?" Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. The figure nodded, its movements slow and deliberate. But as it moved into the light, Ellie saw the truth. This wasn't her mother. It was something far worse. The face twisted, the features distorting into something grotesque, monstrous. The lips curled back, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too many. The eyes, they were black, empty pools that seemed to suck the light out of the cavern. Ellie stumbled back, her legs buckling beneath her as terror surged through her veins. She was too late. She had known this was coming. "Ellie," the creature rasped, its voice a guttural mockery of her mother's. "You've returned?" The darkness pressed in on her from all sides, and Ellie realized with chilling clarity that the cavern wasn't just a place of death. It was alive. It was a living entity, a being that thrived on fear, on despair. And it had claimed her. She turned to flee, but the cavern was shifting, warping, the walls closing in around her. The exit she had come through was no longer there. There was only the endless labyrinth, twisting and turning like the mind of a madman. And the creature was closer now, its footsteps slow but relentless. It was coming for her. Ellie felt the ground begin to shake beneath her. The stone trembled, the very foundation of the cavern groaning in protest. The walls pressed in, and the figure, her mother's twisted reflection, was closing in on her. And then the whisper returned, louder than ever. Return? Ellie's mind screamed, but her body wouldn't listen. The force that had been pulling her was too strong, too powerful. She couldn't escape. She couldn't fight it. The cavern was alive, and it was hungry. Ellie's breath came in ragged gasps, her pulse erratic, like the beat of a dying drum. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but still she ran from the creature that had once been her mother, from the cavern that had become an insatiable beast of its own. Each corner she turned revealed nothing but more darkness, more twisting stone, and more suffocating silence. It felt as if the very walls of the cavern had become part of the hunt, pushing her forward, squeezing her in every direction. The creature's footsteps echoed behind her, a rhythmic and unsettling sound that filled her ears and drowned out everything else. She could feel it gaining on her. It wasn't just the steps, it was the presence. The cold that wrapped around her like a blanket, creeping into her skin, numbing her to the core. It was a presence that knew her, that had always known her, and now, it was claiming her as its own. "Ellie," the voice came again, more chilling this time, echoing through the very stone, bouncing off the walls, reverberating in her skull. It was no longer just a word, it was a command, a summons. She stumbled over her own feet, her mind blurry, her thoughts unraveling. She had no idea how much longer she could run, but her body kept pushing forward, desperate to escape, to survive, to break free from whatever this place had become. But then, everything stopped. She ran into it, into something hard, something cold, something immovable. She slammed into the stone with a sickening thud, her breath knocked out of her chest. Her hands scraped against the surface trying to find purchase, but there was nothing there. No escape, no way out. And then the whispering returned. But this time it wasn't a distant sound. It wasn't a voice. It was a force, a presence all-encompassing, oppressive. Ellie felt it rush over her, washing over her mind and body, drowning her in its weight. It filled her thoughts with images, visions of things that could never be, things that should never be. A figure in the shadows. A child, her child, standing in the rain, looking at her with eyes that weren't hers. Her mother's face, twisted in agony, her mouth open in a scream that wasn't real, a scream that echoed from the depths of the earth. And then, a flicker, a shift in the air. Ellie blinked, and the darkness vanished. She wasn't in the cavern anymore. She was standing in her own living room, her feet planted on the worn rug, the air still and heavy, suffocating in its silence. The lamp flickered above her, casting a dull light that did nothing to chase the shadows back. But something was wrong. Everything was wrong. Ellie's gaze swept across the room, at the closed door, the cracked window, the dust-laden shelves, and there on the wall, the symbol. The same symbol from the cavern. It was etched into the wallpaper, faint but unmistakable. The same symbol that had pulsed with an eerie glow, the one that had drawn her deeper into the labyrinth of the earth. And as she looked at it now, her mind screamed in protest. She tried to step back, but her feet wouldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her thoughts fractured, her mind in turmoil, like an avalanche breaking free. She couldn't understand, couldn't make sense of it. Was this the end? Had she escaped, only to fall into another trap, another layer of the same twisted nightmare? The whisper returned, low and steady. Return? Ellie's stomach lurched, her vision blurring, and she stumbled forward, her hands reaching out to steady herself against the wall. The air around her thickened, closing in, pressing down on her. And then the door creaked open. She didn't hear it at first, lost in her own fear, but then it was unmistakable, the soft creak of hinges, the scraping sound of wood against metal. It was slow, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was coming for her. Ellie turned, and in the dim light, she saw it. A shadow. Tall, thin, elongated. It was a figure familiar but wrong. Her breath caught in her throat. Her own reflection. But it wasn't her. It was a version of her, a twisted mirror of everything she feared. The eyes, wide and hollow, stared back at her, empty of life, devoid of soul. The skin was pale, stretched tight over the bones like it had been molded into place, piece by piece. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. It was as if the figure was trying to speak, but there was nothing left to say. It was already too late. Ellie backed away, but the shadow took a step forward. Then another. And then it reached out. Its hand, cold as ice, wrapped around her wrist, the touch sending a shock of agony through her body. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat, choked by the overwhelming pressure of the creature's grip. Return. The voice was in her mind, not just spoken but felt, deep in her bones, wrapping around her like chains. Ellie's vision began to fade. Her body went numb, and her heart, the one thing she had clung to in the darkness, slowed, its beats becoming weaker, more distant. The figure in front of her leaned closer, its hollow eyes never leaving hers. And then it spoke again. "Welcome home." Ellie tried to scream, but her mouth couldn't move. The darkness took her, swallowing her whole. The last thing she heard was the whisper, the same whisper that had followed her all this time. Return? And then nothing. Story 2. The storm came suddenly as if summoned. Thick, slate-gray clouds rolled across the sky, blotting out the weak light of the setting sun. Rain drummed against the windshield of the old sedan as Daniel drove cautiously along the narrow, winding road that cut through the desolate countryside. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. The GPS had lost signal miles ago, leaving him at the mercy of a hastily printed map and a vague set of directions scribbled by his late grandmother's shaky hand. He shouldn't have come, but guilt was a powerful motivator. She had passed just weeks ago, and the letter she'd left him had been both an invitation and a plea. Return to the house, Daniel. You're the only one who can set things right. The house. He hadn't been there in over 20 years, not since he was a boy. Even then, the place had felt wrong, too big, too dark, too full of secrets. His mother had never spoken of it after they left, but Daniel remembered the way her hands had trembled as she packed their things. Now here he was, guided only by memory and the pull of obligation. The rain intensified, and the road seemed to narrow even further, flanked by dense trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, and Daniel's heart jumped as a shadow darted across the road ahead. He slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. He sat frozen, his pulse pounding in his ears. Nothing. No deer, no animal of any kind. Just rain and the restless sway of the trees. He shook his head and muttered, "Get a grip, Danny." 10 minutes later he saw it. The house stood at the end of the road, partially hidden by the encroaching forest. Time had not been kind to it. The once white paint was now a sickly gray, peeling in long strips. The windows, dark and unwelcoming, seemed to watch him as he pulled into the overgrown driveway. The porch sagged in the middle, and the front door hung slightly ajar, as though waiting. Daniel killed the engine and sat in the car for a moment, listening to the rain hammering the roof. He could still turn around, find a motel for the night, and come back in the morning. But he knew he wouldn't. He'd promised himself he'd see this through, and he wasn't one to break promises. Not anymore. He grabbed his bag and stepped out into the storm. The air was colder than he'd expected, and the wind carried a faint, metallic tang that made his stomach churn. Gravel crunched under his boots as he approached the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The porch groaned under his weight, and he hesitated at the threshold. This is just the house, he told himself. Wooden nails and bad memories. He pushed the door open. The smell hit him first, a pungent blend of mildew, rot, and something sour he couldn't quite place. The interior was as he remembered, high ceilings, narrow hallways, and an oppressive sense of being watched. Furniture draped in yellowed sheets lined the walls, and cobwebs hung like tattered curtains in the corners. Daniel pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards. He took a cautious step forward, the floor creaking loudly in protest. "Hello?" His voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the house. He felt foolish the moment he said it. The letter had been vague, cryptic even. There was no explanation, no instructions, just that plea to come and set things right. But right what? And why now, after all these years? A cold draft swept through the hallway, and Daniel shivered despite himself. He followed the flashlight beam, his steps tentative, his breath shallow. The living room was just as he remembered, a cavernous space dominated by a massive stone fireplace. The mantel was still adorned with faded family photos, their smiling faces now ghostly behind cracked glass. He approached one of the photos and picked it up. It was his mother, younger than he'd ever seen her, holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. She looked happy, but her eyes told a different story, something distant, wary. A loud thump upstairs made him drop the frame. The sound echoed through the house, sharp and deliberate. Daniel froze, every muscle in his body taut. He strained to listen, but the only sound was the rain drumming on the roof. He tried to rationalize it. Old houses made noises. Maybe a branch had fallen, or some small animal had found its way inside. But deep down he didn't believe that. Heart pounding, he climbed the staircase, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Each step groaned loudly, announcing his presence. The upper hallway was even darker than the first floor, the air thick and heavy. The door to his old bedroom was slightly open, and Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He pushed the door open with his foot and shone the flashlight inside. The room was as he'd left it, a twin bed pushed against the far wall, a small desk under the window, and a bookshelf filled with forgotten toys and paperbacks. But the air was different, charged with a strange, electric tension. The thump came again, this time from the closet. Daniel's breath hitched. He stared at the closet door, the flashlight beam quivering on the worn wood. He took a step closer, then another, until he was close enough to reach out. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. His mind screamed at him to stop, to leave, to run, but his body moved of its own accord. He gripped the handle, took a deep breath, and yanked the door open. The closet was empty. Relief flooded him, followed immediately by confusion. He swept the flashlight across the small space, but there was nothing, just old coats and a faint smell of mothballs. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. On the inside of the closet door, scratched into the wood, were 4 words. "IT never left here." Daniel stumbled back, his heart racing. The flashlight slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor and plunging the room into darkness. In the silence that followed, he heard it, a low, guttural whisper that sent ice down his spine. "Welcome home, Danny." Daniel staggered backward, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The words hung in the air, as palpable as the oppressive darkness around him. "Welcome home, Danny." The voice had been soft, almost gentle, but there was something undeniably wrong about it, a distorted undertone that made his skin crawl. His fingers fumbled for the flashlight, the small circle of light flickering back to life as he picked it up. The closet door was still open, the words scratched into the wood starkly visible in the pale beam. "IT never left here." "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "This isn't happening. It's just my mind playing tricks on me." He turned, his flashlight sweeping across the room. Nothing had changed, the same sagging bed, the same dust-covered desk. But the air felt heavier now, as though the house itself was watching him, waiting. The whispering began again, faint and indistinct, like a radio tuned to a distant station. Daniel whipped around, his flashlight darting from corner to corner. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The whispering stopped. A loud bang echoed from downstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Daniel hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to run back to his car and drive until the house was nothing more than a bad memory. But something rooted him in place, a morbid curiosity, or perhaps the faint echo of his grandmother's plea. "Set things right." He swallowed hard and forced himself to move, descending the creaking staircase one cautious step at a time. The air grew colder as he neared the bottom, each breath visible in the faint light of his flashlight. The living room was as he'd left it, the family photos still perched on the mantel like silent witnesses. But the furniture had shifted. The armchair that had been draped in a sheet was now facing the center of the room, the sheet pooled on the floor like a discarded skin. Daniel's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he approached. The chair was empty, but something about it felt wrong. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the worn fabric, and immediately recoiled. It was wet. The dragging sound came again, this time from the kitchen. Daniel turned, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The kitchen door was ajar, and beyond it, he could see faint movement, a shadow shifting just out of sight. He stepped closer, his breath shallow and ragged. The floor was slick underfoot, and when he glanced down, he saw faint smears of something dark trailing from the living room to the kitchen. His stomach turned as the metallic scent hit him. What? The kitchen was colder than the rest of the house, the air sharp and biting. The refrigerator door hung open, its dim light casting long, distorted shadows across the tiled floor. Daniel's flashlight swept the room, landing on a figure crouched in the far corner. It was small, hunched, and wrapped in what looked like a tattered blanket. The figure rocked back and forth, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Hello?" Daniel's voice was barely more than a whisper. The figure stopped rocking. Slowly, it turned its head toward him. Daniel's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering like a dying flame. For a moment, he saw nothing but the outline of the figure. Then the light steadied, and he wished it hadn't. The figure wasn't human, not anymore. Its skin was gray and mottled, stretched too tightly over sharp, angular bones. Its eyes were hollow pits, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that seemed too wide for its face. Daniel stumbled backward, his flashlight shaking in his grip. The figure rose to its feet, its movements jerky and disjointed, like a puppet with tangled strings. "Leave," it rasped, the word scraping out of its throat like rusted metal. "Before it takes you too." Daniel didn't wait to hear more. He turned and ran, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he sprinted back into the living room. The air seemed thicker now, pressing against him like invisible hands. He reached the front door and yanked it open, only to be met with a wall of impenetrable darkness. The storm had worsened, the rain falling in sheets that turned the driveway into a muddy swamp. Behind him, the house groaned, the sound low and mournful, like the sigh of something ancient and hungry. Daniel turned back, his chest heaving. The figure was gone, but the armchair had moved again. It now faced the doorway as though inviting him to sit. He backed away slowly, his hand still on the door handle. "This is insane," he whispered. "I'm losing my mind." But deep down he knew that wasn't true. The scratches on the closet door, the whispering, the thing in the kitchen. It was all real, and he was trapped in the middle of it. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind, "You're the only one who can set things right." But what did that mean? What had she left unfinished? Daniel's eyes fell on the mantel, on the row of family photos that had seemed so innocuous before. He stepped closer, his flashlight beam illuminating each one in turn. There was his mother, younger and happier. His grandmother, stern but kind-eyed. A family gathering in front of the house, everyone smiling except for one figure in the back, a man Daniel didn't recognize. The man's face was blurred, as though the photo itself had tried to erase him. His features were indistinct, but his eyes seemed to stare directly at Daniel, dark and accusing. Daniel's stomach twisted. He reached out to pick up the photo, but the moment his fingers touched the frame, the house shuddered violently. The floorboards creaked and groaned, and the walls seemed to close in around him. The air was filled with a low, guttural growl that reverberated in his chest. The lights flickered to life for the briefest of moments, and Daniel saw something standing at the top of the staircase. It was tall, impossibly so, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its body was shrouded in shadow, but its eyes burned like coals, fixed unerringly on him. Then the lights went out, plunging the house into darkness once more. Daniel didn't wait. He bolted for the front door, his flashlight barely lighting the way. He stumbled down the porch steps and into the rain, his boots slipping in the mud. The car was just ahead, its outline barely visible through the downpour. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped them. As he unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, he risked one last glance at the house. The figure was standing in the doorway now, watching him. Its burning eyes were the only thing visible, twin beacons of malevolence in the darkness. Daniel turned the key, the engine sputtering to life. He didn't care about the mud or the rain, he just needed to get as far away from the house as possible. As he sped down the driveway, the figure didn't move. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching him, its presence lingering like a stain in his mind. He didn't know where he was going, but one thing was certain. Whatever was in that house wasn't finished with him yet. Daniel's hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The rain lashed against the windshield, the wipers barely keeping pace with the downpour. His heart thundered in his chest. The image of those glowing eyes burned into his mind. The narrow dirt road leading away from the house twisted and turned like a snake, the trees on either side looming closer, their gnarled branches clawing at the edges of his vision. The headlights cast fleeting, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own, and for a fleeting moment, Daniel swore he saw a figure dart across the road ahead. "Calm down," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling. "It's just your nerves. You're out of there. You're fine." But even as he said the words, he didn't believe them. The weight of the house lingered in his chest, oppressive and unshakable. The storm intensified, the wind howling like a wounded animal. The car shuddered as a gust slammed into it, and Daniel tightened his grip, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. The house was still visible in the distance, despite the twists and turns of the road. It shouldn't have been, it should have been swallowed by the darkness and trees by now. But there it was, its warped silhouette framed by flashes of lightning. And on the porch stood the figure. Daniel's breath hitched. He slammed the accelerator, the tires skidding briefly before gaining traction. The trees blurred as the car sped forward, but when he looked again, the house was still there. Closer now. The dashboard lights flickered, and the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," Daniel shouted, pounding the steering wheel. The car jerked violently, the headlights dimming. The engine gave one final shudder before dying completely, leaving him in utter darkness. Daniel sat in the silence, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The only sound was the relentless drumming of rain on the roof. He fumbled for his phone, but the screen remained black, unresponsive. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't mechanical, it was deeper, more primal, vibrating through his very bones. Then came the whispering. It started faint, barely audible over the rain. But as it grew louder, Daniel realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the car. "Daniel," the voice crooned, stretching his name into a taunting melody. "You can't run from it. You never could." His pulse pounded in his ears. He grabbed the door handle and threw it open, stumbling into the storm. The rain was icy, soaking him to the bone within seconds. He looked back at the car, half expecting to see the figure sitting in the driver's seat. But it was empty, the headlights flickering weakly in the dark. The road ahead was barely visible, a muddy path winding deeper into the forest. The urge to run was overwhelming, but where could he go? The house was behind him, the car was dead, and the forest felt alive. The trees seemed to shift and sway, their branches reaching toward him like skeletal hands. The wind carried a low, mournful wail that sounded almost human. "You can't stay here," he told himself, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Move. Just move." He started walking, his boots squelching in the mud. The road stretched endlessly before him, each step feeling heavier than the last. The rain blurred his vision, and the wind stung his face, but he pressed on, driven by the primal instinct to get as far away from the house as possible. After what felt like hours, the road split. To the left, the path descended into darkness, the trees growing so thick that even the rain seemed to avoid it. To the right, faint light flickered in the distance. Daniel hesitated. The logical choice was obvious. The light meant people's safety. But his gut twisted at the thought of heading toward it. Something about the light felt wrong. "It's just your fear talking," he muttered. "You're imagining things." He turned toward the light, his steps quickening despite the growing sense of dread. As he drew closer, he realized the light was coming from an old gas station, its neon sign buzzing faintly. The letters were cracked and faded, but he could just make out the word "service." Relief washed over him. The gas station looked abandoned, but there was a chance, just a chance, that someone might be inside. He pushed the door open, the bell above it jangling weakly. The interior was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering sporadically. Rows of dusty shelves lined the walls, stocked with outdated snacks and faded magazines. "Hello?" Daniel called, his voice echoing in the emptiness. No response. He stepped further inside, the floor creaking beneath him. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of oil and mildew. A single light burned behind the counter, illuminating an old cash register and a row of security monitors. The monitors were on, their screens crackling with static. But as Daniel approached, the static cleared and his blood ran cold. The monitors were displaying live footage of the house. He stumbled back, his hand knocking over a display of candy bars. The sound echoed loudly in the stillness, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then the bell above the door jingled. Daniel spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The door was open, swinging gently in the wind, but no one was there. He backed away slowly, his eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to stretch and grow, creeping along the walls like living things. The whispering returned, louder now, surrounding him. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice hissed. The lights flickered violently, and for a brief moment, Daniel saw a figure standing at the far end of the store. It was the same figure from the house, its glowing eyes fixed on him. The lights went out completely, plunging the gas station into darkness. Daniel's breath came in short, panicked gasps. He fumbled for his flashlight, but the beam barely cut through the oppressive blackness. Footsteps echoed behind him, slow and deliberate. He turned, the flashlight shaking in his hands. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just behind him. Daniel didn't dare look. The whispering was right in his ear now, cold and venomous. "It's already inside you, Danny." A hand clamped down on his shoulder, icy and unyielding. Daniel screamed, spinning around and swinging the flashlight wildly. The beam caught nothing but empty air. The lights flickered back on, revealing the gas station exactly as it had been. The monitors were off, the door was closed, and the shelves were untouched. Daniel staggered toward the counter, his hands shaking. He needed answers, and he needed them now. His eyes fell on an old leather-bound notebook sitting beside the cash register. The cover was cracked and faded, but the title was clear, "The History of Blackwood House." Daniel hesitated for only a moment before picking it up. The first page was blank, but as he flipped through, the words seemed to crawl across the paper, forming before his eyes. The story it told was one of pain, betrayal, and a curse that refused to be broken. And at the center of it all was a name he recognized all too well. His own. Daniel's trembling fingers loosened their grip on the notebook, but he couldn't bring himself to let it fall. The words on the page stared back at him, almost mocking in their clarity. Daniel Merrick, heir to the sins of Blackwood House. The storm raged outside, thunder rumbling like the voice of an angry god. The flickering fluorescent light above the counter cast erratic shadows across the room, making the gas station feel like a cage closing in around him. His eyes darted across the text on the page, unable to stop reading despite the growing pit in his stomach. The words were handwritten in a spidery scrawl, uneven and hurried, but they seemed alive, shifting slightly, like they were written just for him. The text unraveled a story of deceit and despair. The Merrick family made a pact, though not all of them knew it. Blood was promised, and blood was taken. The house stands as a monument to their bargain, feeding on the lives of those who dare to enter, calling back the descendants to pay what is owed. Daniel stumbled back, nearly knocking over the counter. His breathing came in shallow gasps, his vision swimming. "This can't be real," he muttered, clutching the edge of the counter to steady himself. "It's a mistake. Some kind of sick coincidence." But deep down he knew better. The notebook felt heavy in his hands, like it was pulling him down into the darkness it described. He flipped the page, and his heart lurched as a faded photograph slipped out, fluttering to the floor. Daniel hesitated before picking it up. The photo was black and white, frayed at the edges. It showed a family standing in front of Blackwood House. A man, a woman, and 2 children. The man looked eerily familiar, his features sharp and stern. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he realized he was staring at his grandfather. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This doesn't make sense. He never mentioned asterisk asterisk." His mind raced, piecing together fragments of forgotten conversations and old family stories. His grandfather had always been tight-lipped about his past, but there had been moments, fleeting, cryptic moments, when he hinted at something darker. A house he refused to speak of. A legacy he wanted no part of. "Why didn't he tell me?" Daniel whispered, anger bubbling up beneath the fear. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" The answer was written in the notebook, clear as day, "Because they knew you'd come. The house doesn't just call, it compels. And it always gets what it's owed." A loud crash snapped Daniel out of his thoughts. The sound came from the back of the gas station, where the storage room door stood slightly ajar. His pulse quickened, the air around him growing colder. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. The only response was the faint creak of the door swinging on its hinges. Daniel's first instinct was to run, to leave the gas station and never look back. But where would he go? The storm still raged outside and the car was useless. Reluctantly, he grabbed the flashlight from the counter and stepped toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, the oppressive silence pressing down on him. The storage room was dark, the faint light from the main area barely penetrating the gloom. Daniel shone his flashlight into the room, revealing rows of shelves stacked with dusty boxes and old tools. The beam caught something at the far end of the room, a figure hunched over, motionless. "Hey," Daniel called, his voice trembling. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. Daniel's grip on the flashlight tightened as he took a cautious step forward. The shadows seemed to writhe around the figure, making it difficult to see clearly. "I'm warning you," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Stay back." He took another step and the figure turned. It wasn't human. The thing's face was a grotesque mask of twisted flesh and jagged teeth, its eyes glowing with the same sickly light he had seen at the house. Its body was thin and contorted, its limbs too long and bending in unnatural ways. Daniel froze, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its glowing eyes locked on him. Then, with a speed that defied logic, it lunged. Daniel stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding the creature's grasp. He swung the flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the darkness. The creature shrieked, recoiling as the light hit it, its body dissolving into shadows. The room fell silent once more, but the oppressive feeling lingered. Daniel's hands shook as he backed out of the storage room, slamming the door shut behind him. His heart raced, his thoughts a chaotic jumble. The creature wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real and it was connected to the house. He looked down at the notebook still clutched in his hand, the words on the page shifting and changing again. This time they formed a single sentence. "It's coming for you." The bell above the door jingled again, and Daniel's head snapped up. Standing in the doorway was a woman, drenched from the rain. Her dark hair clung to her face, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have to help me. It won't let me leave." Daniel stared at her, his mind racing. Was she real, or was this another trick? The desperation in her eyes seemed genuine, but after what he had just seen, he couldn't trust anything, not even his own senses. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. The woman stepped closer, her movements hesitant. "My name is Claire," she said. "I've been trying to escape this place for days, but every road leads back to the house. Please, you have to believe me." Daniel's stomach dropped. The house wasn't just haunting him, it was trapping him. And now it had someone else in its grip. Before he could respond, the lights flickered violently, and the gas station was plunged into darkness once again. The whispering returned, louder than ever, surrounding them both. "It's too late," Claire said, her voice trembling. "It knows we're here." A deafening crash echoed through the station, and the glass windows shattered inward. The wind howled, carrying with it the sound of distant laughter, cold, hollow, and filled with malice. Daniel and Claire exchanged a terrified glance as the shadows began to move, coalescing into a familiar shape. The figure from the house stepped forward, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. The shattered glass crunched beneath Daniel's boots as he backed away from the advancing shadow. His breathing was shallow, his heart hammering in his chest like a drumbeat of impending doom. Claire stood frozen next to him, her eyes wide and unblinking as the figure from the house solidified. It was no longer just a shadow. The shape became clearer with every passing second, its outline shifting from smoke to flesh. Its face was pale and stretched taut, as though the skin barely fit over the bone beneath. Its eyes were two burning pinpricks of light, fixed on Daniel with an intensity that made him feel like prey. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them, filling the air with unintelligible words that somehow burrowed into his mind. They weren't just sounds, they were feelings, thoughts, memories. Daniel clutched his head as images flooded his brain. He saw the house again, but this time it wasn't empty. Figures moved within its walls, people from different eras, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. They walked the halls endlessly, their hands brushing against the walls as though searching for something. "Stop," Daniel muttered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony in his head. "Stop." But the images didn't stop. They intensified. He saw himself as a child, standing in front of the house. His grandfather's hand rested on his shoulder, guiding him forward. But the child version of him resisted, pulling away, tears streaming down his face. "You have to go inside, Daniel," his grandfather said in the memory, his voice stern but tinged with fear. "It's the only way to end this." "No," The child screamed, and the memory dissolved into darkness. Daniel blinked, the gas station snapping back into focus. Claire was shaking his arm, her voice urgent. "Daniel, snap out of it," she cried. "We have to move." The creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring their fear. The air grew colder with each step it took, frost creeping along the edges of the shattered windows. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. "This isn't real," he whispered to himself, trying to ground his thoughts. "It's in my head. It's all in my head." Claire's grip on his arm tightened, pulling him toward the back of the gas station. "Come on," she shouted. "If we stay here, we're dead." Daniel forced his legs to move, stumbling as Claire dragged him into the storage room. She slammed the door shut behind them, plunging them into darkness. What is that thing?" Daniel gasped, his back pressed against the wall. Claire shook her head, her face pale and drawn. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "But it's connected to the house. Everything is." Daniel's chest heaved as he tried to make sense of it all. "How do you know about the house?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. Claire hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as the whispers grew louder. "Because it called me too," she said finally. "Just like it called you." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, called you? You're not making any sense." Claire's hands trembled as she ran them through her wet hair. "I don't know how to explain it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I've been stuck here for days. Every time I try to leave, the roads loop back to the house. It's like it won't let me go." Daniel's mind raced. He thought of the abandoned notebook, the photograph, the whispers. Everything pointed to the same horrifying conclusion. The house wasn't just a place. It was alive. "This is insane," he muttered, his hands shaking as he pressed them to his temples. None of this should be possible. The sound of shattering would interrupted his thoughts. Both Daniel and Claire froze, their eyes snapping to the storage room door. The creature was no longer waiting. It slammed against the door, the wood splintering under the force. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, filling the small space with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. "We have to get out of here," Claire said, her voice barely audible over the noise. "There's a hatch in the floor. I saw it earlier." Daniel nodded, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He followed Claire to the far corner of the room, where she dropped to her knees and began feeling around for the hatch. The creature slammed against the door again, and this time it cracked down the middle. "Hurry," Daniel urged, his voice rising in panic. Claire's fingers found the edge of the hatch, and she yanked it open. A narrow ladder descended into darkness, the air below cold and damp. "Go," she said, motioning for Daniel to climb down. He hesitated for a split second, his eyes darting to the door as it buckled under the creature's assault. Then he scrambled down the ladder, his hands slipping on the rungs in his haste. Claire followed close behind, pulling the hatch shut just as the storage room door shattered. They climbed down into the darkness, the sound of the creature's snarls echoing above them. Daniel's heart pounded as he reached the bottom, his feet landing on cold, wet earth. The air down here was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of decay. Daniel shone his flashlight around, revealing a narrow tunnel that stretched into the distance. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice trembling. Claire shook her head. "I don't know," she said, "but it's the only way out." They moved quickly, the sound of the creature's growls growing fainter as they put distance between themselves and the gas station. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls damp and covered in strange, pulsing veins that glowed faintly in the darkness. Daniel's stomach churned at the sight, but he forced himself to keep moving. "Do you think it's still following us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire glanced over her shoulder, her face pale and drawn. "I don't know," she said, "but we can't stop." The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and Daniel's flashlight revealed a sight that made his blood run cold. The walls of the chamber were covered in symbols, intricate, otherworldly markings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested an object that looked like an old, weathered book. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the chamber with their insidious presence. "What is this?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. Claire stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the book. "I think this is what it wants," she said. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean, what it wants?" Claire turned to him, her expression grim. "The house, the creature, it's all connected to this," she said. "I don't know how, but I think this book is the key." Daniel's mind raced. The symbols, the whispers, the creature, It all led back to this room, to this book. But as he reached for it, the ground beneath him began to tremble, and the whispers turned into screams. "Don't touch it," Claire shouted, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. Daniel's fingers brushed against the book, and the chamber erupted in blinding light. The blinding light engulfed Daniel, searing his vision and filling his head with a deafening roar. He staggered backward, clutching his face as if he could shield himself from whatever was happening. The ground beneath him trembled violently, cracks spreading like veins through the chamber floor. Claire screamed, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "Daniel, what did you do?" But Daniel couldn't answer. His mind was no longer in the chamber. It was somewhere else entirely. Images and sounds flooded his brain, a relentless barrage of memories, emotions, and things that didn't belong to him. He saw the house again, but now it was alive, its walls breathing, its floorboards pulsing like a heartbeat. He saw people trapped inside, their faces twisted in agony, their hands clawing at the walls in a futile attempt to escape. And then he saw the book. It sat in the center of the house, surrounded by darkness that seemed to move like a living thing. The whispers weren't just noise, they were voices. Countless voices, crying out in despair, their words overlapping until they became incomprehensible. But one voice rose above the rest. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, low and cold, reverberating through Daniel's skull. The light faded as suddenly as it had appeared, and Daniel collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The chamber was eerily quiet now, the whispers gone, the trembling earth still. Claire knelt beside him, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Daniel, are you okay? Talk to me." He blinked, his vision slowly coming back into focus. The book still sat on the pedestal, untouched, as if nothing had happened. But Daniel could feel the weight of it now, like it was pressing down on his very soul. "It's the house," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's all connected to the house. The book, it's part of it. It's keeping it alive." Claire's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? How do you know that?" Daniel hesitated, the images from his vision still vivid in his mind. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just saw it, felt it. The house isn't just haunted, it's alive. And it's been feeding on people like us for decades." Claire's face paled. "Feeding? What do you mean, feeding?" Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Their fear, their pain. It traps people, breaks them, and uses their suffering to sustain itself." The realization hit Claire like a punch to the gut. "That's why no one ever leaves," she whispered. "That's why I couldn't leave." Daniel nodded, his hands trembling. "And it won't stop. Not unless we destroy the book." Claire's eyes widened. "Destroy it? How do you know that will work?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't, but I can feel it. The book is the heart of the house. If we destroy it, we might be able to break its hold." Claire glanced at the book, her fear evident. "And what if you're wrong? What if destroying it makes things worse?" Daniel didn't have an answer. He didn't even know if they'd make it out of the chamber alive. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the book was the key to everything. Before either of them could say another word, the chamber began to shake again. This time, the trembling wasn't coming from the ground, it was coming from the walls. The strange, pulsing veins that covered the chamber walls began to writhe, their glow intensifying. The air grew thick and suffocating, a foul odor filling their lungs. And then they heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Daniel's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The growl grew louder, deeper, until it became a roar that shook the very foundation of the chamber. "It's here," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. The creature from the gas station emerged from the darkness, its form even more terrifying in the confined space. Its burning eyes fixed on Daniel, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "You can't stop it," the creature said, its voice a guttural snarl that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. "The house has claimed you. You belong to it now." Daniel clenched his fists, his fear replaced by a surge of defiance. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. He grabbed the book from the pedestal, the whispers returning in full force. The moment his hands touched the weathered leather, pain shot through his body like lightning. He screamed, dropping to his knees, but he didn't let go. The creature lunged at him, its claws outstretched, but Claire stepped between them, holding up the flashlight like a weapon. The beam of light hit the creature's face, and it recoiled, hissing in anger. Hurry, Daniel! Claire shouted, her voice filled with desperation. Daniel gritted his teeth, forcing himself to his feet. The book burned in his hands, but he ignored the pain, focusing on the whispers. They weren't just voices, they were instructions. He flipped through the pages, the symbols glowing faintly. The words were incomprehensible, but something about them felt familiar, like he'd seen them before. "What are you doing?" Claire yelled, her voice breaking as the creature advanced again. Daniel didn't answer. His fingers moved on their own, tracing the symbols on the pages. The air around him grew colder, the whispers louder, until they were all he could hear. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The creature froze mid-lunge, its burning eyes wide with shock. The walls of the chamber stopped pulsing, the glowing veins fading to black. Daniel looked up, the book still in his hands. The symbols on the pages had rearranged themselves, forming a single word that burned itself into his mind. "Release," he whispered, the word foreign yet familiar on his tongue. The chamber erupted in light once more, but this time, it wasn't blinding. It was warm, comforting, like sunlight breaking through a storm. The creature let out a deafening scream, its form dissolving into smoke as the light consumed it. The walls of the chamber began to crumble, the veins disintegrating into ash. Claire grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him toward the tunnel. "We have to go. Now." They ran, the tunnel shaking as the chamber collapsed behind them. The light followed them, growing brighter and brighter until it swallowed everything. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. Daniel and Claire found themselves standing outside the house, the cold night air biting at their skin. The house loomed behind them, dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes staring into the void. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire turned to Daniel, her face pale but determined. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked at the house, his heart heavy with uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we've only just begun." The silence of the night was suffocating. Daniel and Claire stood outside the house, their breaths visible in the frigid air, their minds racing with unanswered questions. The structure before them, once alive with ominous energy, now stood still. It looked abandoned, nothing more than an old, dilapidated building. But Daniel knew better. His hand throbbed where he had held the book. Though the light had vanished and the creature was gone, he could still feel a faint, burning pulse beneath his skin, like an ember that refused to die. Claire broke the silence. "If we've stopped it, why does it feel worse?" Daniel turned to her, his face lined with exhaustion and something deeper, fear. "Because it's not over." Claire's eyes darted back to the house. It was no longer pulsating or glowing, but it still loomed over them like a predator lying in wait. "What do we do now?" she asked, hugging herself against the cold. Daniel didn't answer immediately. His thoughts were a whirlwind of fragmented visions, the symbols in the book, and the single word that had echoed in his mind: release. "There's something else," he finally said, his voice steady but low. "Something we didn't see. The book isn't gone, Claire. I think it's still in there." Claire stared at him in disbelief. "You're saying we have to go back in? After everything we just saw?" Daniel nodded grimly. "If we leave it here, it'll just start over. The house will rebuild itself and it'll find new victims. We have to finish this." Claire opened her mouth to argue, but she stopped. Deep down she knew he was right. She had lived with the house's presence for years, unable to escape its pull. Even now, standing outside it, she could feel its darkness brushing against her mind, whispering to her like an old friend. "Fine," she said, her voice barely audible. "But if we're doing this, we need a plan." Daniel took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We need to find the book. The real one. What I touched in the chamber, it was just a piece of it. The heart of the house is still hidden somewhere inside." Claire frowned. "And how do we find it?" "That place is a labyrinth, Daniel. It could be anywhere." Daniel hesitated, the memory of his vision flashing before him. The house breathing, the walls alive, the book at its center. "It's not just anywhere," he said. "It's in the core, the heart of the house. If we can reach it, we can destroy it for good." Claire looked at him skeptically. "And what happens if we don't make it out?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the house, his jaw set. "We have to try." The air grew colder as they approached the front door. It creaked open on its own, as if inviting them back inside. Daniel felt the weight of his fear settle on his chest, but he pushed it aside. The interior of the house was eerily quiet. Gone were the whispers, the creaks, and the groans. The oppressive energy that had once filled the air was subdued, like a predator waiting to pounce. Claire stayed close to Daniel, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam illuminated the familiar, decayed furniture, the peeling wallpaper, and the long, empty corridors. But something was different. The house felt smaller. "Do you feel that?" Claire whispered. Daniel nodded. The walls seemed closer together, the ceiling lower. It was as if the house itself was shrinking, pulling them deeper into its grip. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Every creak of the floorboard sent a jolt of tension through them, but nothing jumped out. Nothing attacked. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for them to make the next move. As they turned a corner, Daniel froze. The hallway stretched out before them, impossibly long. Doors lined the walls, each one slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. "This wasn't here before," Claire said, her voice trembling. Daniel didn't respond. He could feel the house's presence pressing down on him, urging him to choose a door to step inside. But he resisted. "It's a trick," he said. "The house is trying to confuse us. We have to keep moving." Claire nodded, but her eyes lingered on the doors. She could hear faint sounds coming from behind them, whispers, laughter, even the faint cry of a child. "Daniel, wait," she said, grabbing his arm. "What if it's not a trick? What if we have to go through one of them to find the book?" Daniel hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to keep moving. But Claire was right. The house wouldn't make it easy for them. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "But we stay together. No matter what happens, we don't split up." Claire nodded, and they approached the nearest door. The sound behind it grew louder, a soft, melodic humming. It was almost soothing, like a lullaby. Daniel pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The room was unlike anything they'd seen in the house before. It was bright and warm, sunlight streaming through large windows. A woman sat in a rocking chair by the fireplace, humming softly as she knitted a scarf. For a moment, Daniel and Claire were stunned. The room was a perfect snapshot of normalcy, a stark contrast to the decayed, haunted house they had been exploring. The woman looked up and smiled. "Oh, you're here," she said, her voice kind and welcoming. "I've been waiting for you." Daniel took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run. But Claire stepped forward, her face filled with confusion. "Who are you?" The woman chuckled softly. "Don't you recognize me, dear? I've been here all along." Daniel grabbed Claire's arm, pulling her back. "It's not real," he whispered. "None of this is real." The woman's smile faded, and her eyes darkened. "Oh, but it is," she said, her voice losing its warmth. "And you've made a terrible mistake coming back here." The room began to change. The sunlight dimmed, the walls peeling away to reveal the rotting wood beneath. The woman's form twisted, her face elongating, her eyes turning black. "Run!" Daniel shouted, dragging Claire toward the door. They burst back into the hallway, the room behind them dissolving into darkness. The hallway had changed again, the doors gone, replaced by a single staircase leading down into the depths of the house. Claire looked at Daniel, her face pale. "This is it, isn't it? The heart of the house." Daniel nodded, his throat dry. "Yeah, this is it." They descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The walls around them pulsed faintly, like they were alive. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling their heads with incomprehensible words. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a vast, cavernous room. The book sat on a pedestal in the center, glowing faintly. But this time it was different. The symbols on its cover were moving, shifting like they were alive. "We destroy it," Daniel said, his voice firm. Claire hesitated, her fear evident. "And what happens to us if we do?" Daniel didn't answer. He stepped forward, his hand reaching for the book. The whispers grew louder, the walls closing in around them. The house wasn't going to let them go without a fight. The air in the cavernous room seemed to thicken, as though the house itself was inhaling deeply, drawing the two of them closer to the heart of its darkness. The book on the pedestal, once just a mysterious object, now pulsed with an eerie, otherworldly energy. Its symbols twisted, shifting as though alive, mocking their every movement. Daniel felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. This was it. He turned to Claire, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't hesitate," he said. His voice cracked under the weight of his words. "If we don't stop it now, we'll never get out. We have to destroy it." Claire nodded, though she was visibly shaken. "But how?" Daniel's gaze flickered toward the book. The closer they got to it, the stronger the oppressive feeling became, as if the very air around them was growing heavier, suffused with an ancient malice. He didn't know how to destroy it, but he knew one thing: this was the only chance they had. Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the book. The moment his fingers brushed the cover, the world seemed to blur around him. The room twisted, and the ground beneath them seemed to shudder, as if the house was waking up, aware of their intrusion. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the room, deep and guttural, like the sound of something ancient stirring from a long slumber. Daniel's heart raced. "Claire, get back!" He shouted, but it was too late. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall and distorted, its form flickering between human and something else, something wrong. It was as if the darkness itself had taken shape, coiling around the edges of the room, feeding on the fear they had brought with them. Claire gasped, stepping back. "What is that?" Daniel's eyes widened. The figure was no longer just a shadow. It was real, and it was coming toward them. "We have to move," he said, grabbing Claire's arm, but the figure didn't seem to care about them. Its attention was focused solely on the book, and Daniel realized with a sinking feeling that the figure wasn't merely a manifestation. It was the entity the house had been hiding all along. It was alive. The creature let out a low, vibrating growl, and the room seemed to bend under its weight, the walls warping as if struggling to contain it. The book on the pedestal was the source of its power. "We have to destroy it," Daniel repeated, more urgently this time. The creature's eyes fixed on Daniel with a burning intensity, its black gaze full of malice. "You don't understand," it hissed, its voice like the scraping of nails on a chalkboard. "You can never destroy it. You only feed it." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. "No, we can end this. We can stop you." The creature laughed, a sound that reverberated through the room like a thunderclap. It took a step toward them, and the very ground beneath its feet seemed to shudder, as if the house itself was groaning in protest. "You cannot stop what has always been," it said. "You think this house is haunted, that the evil here is contained? No, the house is but a vessel. The evil is the house itself." The realization hit Daniel like a physical blow. "What do you mean? This house, it is the evil?" The creature smiled, showing teeth that were far too sharp for anything human. "The house was built to keep me, to contain the power that lies beneath. And now you have awakened it." Daniel glanced at Claire. She was shaking, but her eyes were filled with determination. "We have to destroy it. We have to." With trembling hands, Daniel reached for the book again. As his fingers brushed its surface, the room exploded in light, a blinding flash that seemed to tear at his very soul. He felt the pull of the book, its power, its weight, dragging him deeper into the house, deeper into the darkness. "No," Claire cried, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. But it was too late. Daniel's vision blurred, and in the chaotic light, he saw the creature's grin widen, growing impossibly large. "You will never escape," it whispered. "The house owns you now." Suddenly, the floor beneath them gave way, and they were falling, plummeting into the depths of the house, the walls closing in on them. Daniel reached out, trying to grab something, anything to stop their fall, but there was nothing. The darkness swallowed them whole. When Daniel's eyes opened, he was no longer in the room with the pedestal. The air was thick with dust, and the floor beneath him was cold and unforgiving. He could feel the weight of something pressing down on him, something that wasn't quite the house, but something that had been born from it. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. His head throbbed, and he felt disoriented, as if the ground had shifted beneath him while he had been unconscious. Claire was next to him, looking just as bewildered. She groaned, pushing herself into a sitting position. "What happened?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Daniel didn't have an answer. His mind was a blur of images, half-seen visions of the creature, the book, the endless dark halls of the house. He glanced around. The room they were in was unfamiliar, but it felt wrong. Every corner seemed to close in on them, every shadow seemed to watch their every move. "I don't know," he said, his voice strained. "But we're still in here, and we're running out of time." Claire stood, her eyes scanning the room. The walls were made of old stone, cracked and decaying. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, symbols that seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. It was a language she didn't recognize, but it seemed familiar in a way that unsettled her. "This place," Claire whispered. It's alive." Daniel nodded grimly. "I know. It's always been alive. We've just been too blind to see it." Suddenly, the floor rumbled and a low, guttural growl echoed through the walls. The air grew cold and the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, taking shape. "It's here," Daniel said, his voice tight with fear. "The heart of the house is waking up." But there was no escaping it now. The floor beneath Daniel and Claire groaned as though it were struggling to hold them up. The walls pulsed with a rhythm that felt alive, breathing, as if the house itself had become a living, hungry thing. A chill ran down Daniel's spine, the air thickening around them, heavy with the stench of decay and something far worse. The shadows, once still, now seemed to crawl, creeping slowly, filling every corner of the room. Claire's voice trembled, but her words were steady. "What do we do now?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of what he had seen. The book, the creature, the whispering shadows, and trying to make sense of it all. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a prison. And now the entity inside it was free, awakened by their presence. "We need to find a way out," Daniel said, his voice low. But even as he spoke, he knew how hollow his words were. This house had been built to keep something in. Now, whatever it was, it wanted out, and it would stop at nothing to claim them both. He grabbed Claire's hand and pulled her toward a narrow hallway that stretched out before them, its dark end lost in the oppressive blackness. The air grew heavier with each step, and every noise felt like it was magnified. Footsteps echoing in the silent void, the sound of their breathing loud and labored. Suddenly, the floor shook again, more violently this time. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows creeping toward them, reaching out like cold fingers. A loud crash came from somewhere ahead of them, followed by the unmistakable sound of scratching, like nails on wood. Daniel's heart raced. "We need to keep moving," he said, urgency in his voice. "If we stop now, we'll never get out." Claire nodded, but her face was pale with fear. "It's coming for us, isn't it?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew what was hunting them. The house itself was alive with it. The growls, the scratches, they were all signs of the house shifting, adapting, changing to trap them. They reached a small door at the end of the hallway. It was cracked open, an unnatural light spilling out from the gap. Daniel reached for the door handle, but before he could touch it, a voice, low, guttural, and unmistakably unnatural, whispered from the darkness behind them. "You should have stayed away." Daniel spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. The air felt charged like the atmosphere before a storm. The shadows in the hallway were no longer just shadows. They had taken form, twisting into grotesque shapes. Eyes glowed in the dark, staring at them with malevolent intent. "You open the door," the voice continued, its tone full of menace. "Now you will see what happens when the door is left open." Suddenly, the room seemed to pulse, and the shadows lunged forward. A force, an invisible, crushing pressure, pushed against Daniel, pinning him to the ground. Claire screamed, her voice filled with terror as the darkness enveloped them. Daniel gasped for air, struggling to move, but the pressure was overwhelming. He looked at Claire, her face twisted in horror, and in that moment he knew they were running out of time. "Claire, hold on," he shouted, his voice raw with panic. "We can make it." But the shadows didn't seem to care about their pleas. The darkness grew stronger, its tendrils reaching toward them, consuming everything in its path. The door, still ajar, beckoned them with a pale, flickering light, but it was a false hope. The more they struggled, the more the shadows seemed to close in. With a final, desperate effort, Daniel lunged forward, grabbing Claire's arm and pulling her toward the door. He didn't look back. He couldn't. They had to get out or they would be swallowed whole by the house. The door slammed open and they tumbled into the next room, gasping for breath. The shadows for now were left behind. But the room they had entered was no better. It was vast, the ceiling stretching high above them, and the walls were lined with grotesque carvings, ancient symbols, twisted faces, and images of things that shouldn't be seen by human eyes. The room seemed to go on forever, and as they looked around, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. "What is this place?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. But in the back of his mind, a horrible truth was beginning to settle in. There was no escape. Not from this house. Not from whatever was trapped inside. And whatever it was hungry. Suddenly, a sound echoed from deep within the room, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Daniel turned, his heart freezing in his chest. A figure emerged from the shadows, its face obscured by a cloak of darkness. The air grew cold and the room seemed to shift again, distorting in unnatural ways. "You shouldn't have come," the figure said, its voice like the scrape of metal on stone. "You're already too late." Daniel's pulse raced, his mind spinning. The figure moved forward, and with each step, the walls seemed to grow closer. The room was shrinking, suffocating them. He had to act, had to do something, or they would be consumed just like everyone else who had ever entered this cursed place. But before he could react, the figure raised its hand and the room froze. Every sound, every movement ceased. And in that moment of stillness, Daniel felt the weight of the house's eyes upon him. The creature, the darkness, it was all connected to the house. It had always been connected. And now it was coming for them both. The stillness was suffocating. Daniel's breath, shallow and rapid, was the only sound in the air, breaking the oppressive silence that had settled like a blanket over the room. He didn't dare move, not with that figure standing before him, its face still hidden in the shadows, the air around it thick with malice. The temperature had dropped drastically, and even Claire, standing beside him, shivered uncontrollably. The figure's words, "you're already too late," they reverberated in his mind like a constant hum, a terrible truth that he couldn't escape. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, closing in inch by inch, until it felt as though the room itself was breathing. The shadows pressed in from every side, crawling closer with every passing second. For a moment, it felt like time itself had frozen. The air was thick with dread, and Daniel's thoughts became disjointed, scattered like leaves in a storm. He reached for Claire's hand, squeezing it tightly, but even that small act of comfort felt fragile, as if the world around them was about to shatter. The figure moved forward, its steps deliberate and slow, each one echoing in the vast, shrinking room. As it came closer, the cold deepened, wrapping around them like a freezing fog. The darkness in the room seemed to respond to its presence, creeping along the walls like a living thing, the carvings shifting and twitching in the dim light. "You don't understand," the figure's voice said, now almost a whisper. "The house never forgets. It holds on to everything. And you are part of it now." The words were like a punch to the gut. Daniel could feel the weight of their meaning, the suffocating sense of inevitability creeping up on him. He had been a fool, hadn't he? Thinking he could just wander into a place like this and leave without consequence. The house, this twisted, sentient place, was far older than anything he had ever imagined. And now it was too late to turn back. The door had been opened and there was no closing it again. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its presence so oppressive that Daniel felt his body freeze in place, as if some invisible force was holding him there, paralyzed. Claire's grip tightened around his hand, but he could sense her fear, her body trembling as much as his. She had always been the strong one, the rational one, the one who had kept him grounded when the world felt too heavy. But now, even she seemed to be losing her grip on reality. "The past isn't finished with you," the figure continued, its voice like the scrape of nails on glass. "It never is. You brought it with you." The words were like ice in his veins, freezing his thoughts. Daniel tried to focus, to make sense of what was happening, but the more he tried, the less clarity he had. His mind was a tangled mess of past memories, flashes of moments he had buried deep, things he had never wanted to remember. He had come here to escape, to start over, but instead, it seemed the past had followed him. And now it was catching up. The figure raised its hand, and the temperature dropped even further, to the point where Daniel could see his own breath forming in the air. The shadows on the walls began to move again, swirling, shifting, as if they had a will of their own. The room was no longer just a room. It was alive, breathing, and Daniel could feel it, a weight pressing down on his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. "Do you feel it?" the figure asked, its voice now so close that Daniel could feel its cold breath on his face. "The house is waking up, and it will never let you leave. Not unless it has what it wants." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, the fear growing, spreading through his limbs like a poison. What did the house want? What could it possibly want from them? He thought of the book, the one they had found earlier, its pages stained with something dark and ancient. He had thought it was just a relic, a piece of history, but now he understood. It wasn't just a book, it was a key, and they had turned it. "What is it that you want?" Daniel forced himself to ask, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. For a moment, the figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped back, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift with it, drawing away from Daniel and Claire, only to gather again in the corners, more intense than before. The air grew colder still, and the room seemed to stretch, becoming impossibly vast. It felt as though the walls were moving, closing in on them, and yet the distance between them and the figure remained the same. The figure smiled, or at least Daniel thought it did. He couldn't see its face clearly enough to be sure, but the sense of malevolent satisfaction radiated from it like a physical force. "What do I want?" The figure's voice was laced with a cruel amusement. "I want you to understand what you've done. The house, the entity within, it is a part of you now, Daniel. Part of your soul. Part of your past. And I want it back." Claire gasped, stepping back, her eyes wide with fear. "No. No, that can't be. We didn't mean any harm. We didn't know." But the figure didn't answer. It simply raised its hand, and the shadows surged forward again, swirling around them in an ever-tightening grip. The cold was unbearable now, biting into their skin, numbing their limbs. Daniel could barely move. It felt as if something was pushing down on his chest, suffocating him. "You have no idea what you've woken up," the figure whispered, its voice sending chills down Daniel's spine. "You will find out soon enough. The house doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget. And now you belong to it." The last of the light in the room flickered out, plunging them into total darkness. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around them like a living, breathing thing. Daniel tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. He could feel Claire's grip slipping from his own, the cold creeping in like a fog, smothering everything. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness lifted. Daniel was gasping for breath, disoriented, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around, but the room had changed. The walls had faded, leaving only the dark void behind them. He was no longer in the room he had just seen. The house, it seemed, had shifted again. He didn't have time to process what was happening. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, like a haunting echo. Claire was nowhere to be seen. "Claire?" he whispered, but the word felt strange, wrong. The silence that followed was deafening. And as Daniel stood there, alone in the void, he realized something that chilled him to the bone. He wasn't alone. The house was watching, and it would never let him go. Daniel stood motionless, the darkness pressing in on all sides, suffocating him. His thoughts scrambled for coherence, but there was only a heavy fog that clouded his mind. His breath came in ragged gasps, but even the air felt wrong, thick with something he couldn't identify, something ancient. He called out for Claire again, his voice trembling in the oppressive silence. "Claire, where are you?" But the only response was the echo of his own words bouncing off the cold, invisible walls. His heart hammered in his chest, the quiet around him growing louder with each passing second. The house was alive, and it was waiting. Waiting for something, no, someone. He couldn't stand it. He had to move. He needed to find Claire. With his heart in his throat, Daniel took a step forward, the floor beneath him creaking loudly in the silence. It sounded too loud, too deliberate. Every small noise seemed amplified, a reminder that he was not alone in this nightmare. The shadows seemed to watch him, curling around his feet like tendrils, drawing closer with every step. His mind raced with fear, but something else had begun to creep in too, something deeper. The house, this place, it was changing him, warping his thoughts. He could feel it, pulling him into its dark embrace. He had to find Claire, but the more he searched, the more he felt her slipping away from him, as if the very essence of this place was making her vanish into thin air. The air turned colder still, so cold that Daniel could see his breath fogging in front of him. His skin prickled with a familiar sensation. Something was watching him. Something far worse than just the house. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, but the darkness was still, unmoving. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. Movement. A figure, faint at first, emerged from the edge of his vision, barely noticeable, but enough to make his heart skip a beat. His pulse quickened. His breath caught in his throat. He turned, eyes wide, but whatever he had seen was gone. The shadows behind him flickered, alive. He could feel them, skittering across the floor, reaching for him like a million hands. They pulled at his ankles, curling around his feet, as if trying to drag him into the depths of the darkness. Daniel stumbled back, terror rising in his chest. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of Claire, any sign of escape. But the darkness around him seemed endless, an abyss that swallowed everything in its path. The walls were gone, the floor was gone. It was as if the house had ceased to exist, leaving him in a void with nothing but the shadows that clawed at him from all sides. "Claire?" he shouted again, his voice breaking. This time he heard something, a faint sound in the distance, like a whisper, barely audible but unmistakably familiar. "Claire." He moved toward the sound, his feet heavy as though the very ground was pulling him back. The shadows seemed to be thickening with every step, crawling over the floor like liquid, their dark forms twisting and writhing. Then a light, a flicker. He squinted into the distance, hoping, praying that it was real. The dim glow was the faintest shred of hope. He took a step forward, then another, his heart pounding in his ears. The light grew brighter as he moved toward it, and for a brief moment he thought he saw Claire, standing there just ahead of him, her face pale and wide-eyed as if trapped in the same nightmare. But as he got closer, the figure shifted and his blood ran cold. It wasn't Claire. It was the figure, the same one that had spoken before. The one that had warned him. It stood before him now, its form flickering, almost phantasmal. The face was still hidden, but Daniel could feel its eyes on him, burning through the darkness. "You shouldn't have come," the figure's voice echoed, its tone laced with the same malice that had haunted him since the moment he entered this place. "You belong to the house now, and the house will never let you leave." Daniel staggered back, panic flooding his veins. His chest tightened, the air thickening with the figure's presence. The shadows closed in around him again, this time suffocating, an inescapable wave that threatened to drown him. He couldn't breathe. The figure's hand raised slowly, and with it, the shadows grew darker, more oppressive. Daniel tried to move, to run, but his feet felt like they were rooted to the spot. "No," he screamed, the word escaping in a ragged sob. But the figure didn't answer. Instead, the shadows began to writhe and twist, their forms becoming more solid, more defined. A figure, a monstrous, twisted thing, began to emerge from the darkness, its shape jagged and unnatural. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seemed to close in around him, trapping him in this suffocating nightmare. He was surrounded. There was nowhere to go. Then, just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, it vanished, leaving nothing but the heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with fear and confusion. Had it been real? Had any of it been real? But then he heard it again. A whisper. A voice, soft, distant, but unmistakably Claire's. "Daniel?" His heart leaped in his chest. He spun around, searching, desperate. He had to find her. He had to escape. But the voice was fading. Faint. "Claire?" Daniel ran, his legs heavy and uncooperative, his mind consumed by the sound of her voice. He couldn't see her, but he could hear her, just beyond the reach of his vision. And then he saw it. The door. A doorway standing alone in the darkness, a faint light spilling from beneath it. Without hesitation, Daniel surged forward, every muscle in his body screaming with the need to escape. The door loomed ahead, and with each step, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. Claire's voice was calling to him, pulling him toward that final hope. He reached for the door. His hand was trembling as he gripped the cold handle. And then, just as he was about to open it, the door slammed shut. The room around him plunged into complete darkness. The darkness was suffocating. It pressed in on him from all sides, heavy and oppressive, like 1,000 unseen hands closing around his chest. Daniel stood frozen, his heart hammering in his ears, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The world around him was nothing but a void, a black sea that seemed to stretch out forever. He reached out in desperation, feeling for anything to steady himself, but there was nothing. No walls, no floors, just the endless emptiness. It was as though the house itself had disappeared, leaving him adrift in the void. Then the whisper came again. Faint at first, barely a breath of sound, but unmistakable. "Claire." "Daniel?" His pulse quickened. He knew it wasn't just his mind playing tricks on him. He had heard it clearly, her voice, real and raw, desperate for him. He had to find her. He couldn't let her disappear into this nightmare. But how? The darkness twisted around him, closing in tighter, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into its depths. The shadows danced at the edges of his vision, darting and flickering like something alive. He tried to step forward, but his feet wouldn't move. The ground beneath him felt like it was melting away, as though the very foundation of the house was collapsing into the nothingness. "Claire?" he called out, his voice trembling with fear. "Where are you?" There was no answer. The silence that followed was deafening, more suffocating than the darkness itself. His eyes strained against the blackness, searching for any sign of her, but the room was still, nothing moving except the shadows. And then, there it was again. A flicker of light just ahead of him. A weak, dim glow, like the last dying embers of a fire long since extinguished. It beckoned to him, a lifeline in the overwhelming black. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had to go toward it. He had to find Claire. She was out there. He could feel it. With trembling hands, he stepped forward, each movement slow and deliberate, as though the very air around him was trying to hold him back. The shadows seemed to lash out, brushing against his skin, like cold fingers dragging across his flesh. He could almost hear them whispering to him, mocking him, pulling him into the dark. But he couldn't stop. Not now. The light grew brighter with each step, and just as he thought he might reach it, something horrible happened. The floor beneath him cracked, splitting open with a deafening sound. Daniel gasped, his body jerking backward as the ground gave way. He stumbled, falling to his knees, his arms flailing out to catch himself. But there was nothing. The darkness surged around him, swallowing him whole. He screamed as he was pulled into the abyss, his mind racing, his heart pounding, the sensation of falling endless, as though the world itself was tearing apart around him. The light was gone, replaced by an even deeper blackness. And then, just as suddenly, the fall stopped. Daniel hit the ground with a sickening thud, his body jarred by the impact. He gasped for air, his head spinning, disoriented. For a moment, he just lay there, his body trembling, trying to make sense of what had happened. The darkness still pressed in on him, but it felt different. Less oppressive, less suffocating. It was as though he had fallen into another world, one that felt both familiar and alien at the same time. He pushed himself up, his hands scraping against the cold, damp floor. The air smelled stale, musty, like something long abandoned. He could barely make out the shape of the walls, their edges fading into the darkness. But something was there. He could feel it. His heart skipped in his chest as he heard a faint sound. A soft, almost imperceptible breathing. It was Claire. Daniel? Her voice was distant, weak, like a dream fading in and out of reality. But it was her. He could hear it. He stumbled to his feet, the darkness closing in around him once again. The walls seemed to press against him, narrowing, trapping him in this new, horrifying place. "Claire, where are you?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the cold stone walls. But again there was no immediate answer. Only silence. And then, from the corner of the room, a shape began to take form. Slowly, it emerged from the shadows, its outline becoming clearer as the darkness seemed to retreat, almost as if it feared the thing that was coming. It was a figure. A woman. Claire. She was standing there, just out of reach, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Her clothes were torn, her hair wild, but it was her. Daniel's heart soared at the sight of her, but something was wrong. Her body was standing perfectly still, but her eyes were empty, hollow. She stared at him, but there was no recognition in her gaze. No warmth. No life. "Claire?" Daniel whispered, his voice breaking as he reached for her. But when his hand brushed against her arm, she dissolved. Not vanished, not disappeared, but dissolved. Like smoke, like mist fading into the wind. Daniel fell to his knees, a raw sob escaping his throat. He could feel it deep inside him, the crushing, cold weight of loss, of something irreversible. There was nothing left of her. Just shadows. The shadows that were closing in again. "No?" he whispered, the word barely escaping his lips. "No?" But the darkness was relentless. It surrounded him, engulfing him once again, drowning him in its cold, empty void. His pulse throbbed in his ears, his thoughts spiraling into chaos. And then a voice, not Claire's, but something darker, something far worse. "You're too late." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating through his skull, as if the very walls were alive with them. The air grew thick with malice, and Daniel could feel the weight of the house itself bearing down on him. He was trapped. Trapped in this place that was no longer a house, no longer a reality. The shadows closed in, swallowing him whole. The last thing he saw was a single, flickering light, just like the one that had drawn him in. And then there was nothing. Story 3. The rain came down in relentless sheets, slapping against the windshield as the old sedan struggled up the winding mountain road. Each turn seemed steeper than the last, and the headlights barely pierced the suffocating fog that clung to the treetops like ghostly shrouds. Laura tightened her grip on the wheel, her knuckles pale in the dim glow of the dashboard. She hadn't planned to be out here, not tonight, not ever. But fate had a funny way of leading you to the one place you swore you'd never return to. The Hollow. The name alone made her stomach churn. It wasn't a town anymore, not really. Just a cluster of crumbling buildings hidden deep in the woods, a forgotten relic of another time. It was where her mother had grown up, where dark family secrets were buried like rotting corpses. Laura had promised herself she'd leave all that behind. But when the lawyer's letter came last week, cold and clinical, she knew there was no escaping it. Estate transfer. Deceased relative. Immediate attention required. The words had carried a weight she couldn't ignore. So here she was, driving through the storm toward the place she'd spent years trying to forget. The road narrowed abruptly, and the trees closed in, their skeletal branches scraping against the sides of the car like claws. A shiver ran down her spine as she glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Almost there, she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, but she remembered the way. The Hollow had a way of sticking to you no matter how hard you tried to shake it. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the road. Laura slammed the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. The car skidded, tires screeching on the slick pavement before jerking to a stop. She sat there, breathing hard, eyes scanning the darkness. Had it been an animal? A deer maybe? Or something else? The woods were silent except for the rain. Too silent. After a moment, she exhaled and shook her head. Get it together, Laura. She eased her foot off the brake and pressed on, the tires crunching over wet gravel. The house loomed out of the fog like a specter, its jagged silhouette illuminated by a single flickering porch light. It was larger than she remembered, or maybe her childhood mind had shrunk it over the years. The windows were dark, gaping holes that seemed to swallow the light. She killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the place. A sudden wave of unease washed over her, tightening her chest. It wasn't just the house. It was what it represented. The past. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the key from the ignition. She glanced at the letter on the passenger seat, the paper slightly crumpled from her grip. Inherited property. Pending inventory and documentation. She sighed and shoved the letter into her bag. The sooner she got this over with, the sooner she could leave. The porch creaked under her weight as she stepped onto it, the sound echoing in the stillness. She fumbled with the keys, her hands slick with rain, and slid the old brass one into the lock. It turned with a reluctant click, and the door swung inward. The air inside was heavy and stale, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Her flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing faded wallpaper, sagging furniture, and an old grandfather clock that had long since stopped ticking. Home sweet home, she muttered under her breath. She moved through the house cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the damp, threadbare carpet. Every corner seemed to hold a shadow, every creak of the floorboards a whisper. And then she saw it. A single photograph, propped up on the mantel above the cold, ashen fireplace. Her heart stopped. It was an old black and white picture, faded with age, but she recognized the faces instantly. Her mother as a young girl, standing next to a woman with hollow eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. Grandmother. But there was something else, something that made Laura's skin crawl. In the background, barely visible in the photograph's shadows, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, watching. Laura tore her gaze away, her breathing ragged. Her chest felt tight, and her pulse hammered in her ears. It was just an old photo. Nothing more. She turned away, determined to ignore the growing unease gnawing at her. But as she moved through the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. In the kitchen, the faucet dripped steadily, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. She opened the cupboards, finding little more than dust and mouse droppings. But when she turned to leave, she froze. The door to the basement was open. She hadn't opened it. The staircase leading down was narrow and steep, the darkness below impenetrable. Laura hesitated, her flashlight beam trembling as it pointed into the void. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. She swallowed hard and took a cautious step forward. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight, and the air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, the basement was damp and cluttered, filled with old furniture and cardboard boxes. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of strange, murky liquids. And then she heard it. A soft rustling like fabric brushing against fabric. Her flashlight darted to the corner and she froze. Something moved. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, crouched low to the ground. Her breath caught in her throat, and the flashlight flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When the beam steadied again, the corner was empty, but the sense of being watched remained. Laura backed up, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the staircase. Her foot caught on something, a loose board, and she stumbled, catching herself just in time. When she looked down, she saw what had tripped her. A small leather-bound book. The cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against the embossed letters on the front. The Chronicles of the Hollow. Her stomach churned as she opened it, the words inside written in an elegant, spidery script. The first page read, "To those who enter unbidden, beware. The Hollow does not forgive, and it never forgets." A loud crash echoed upstairs and Laura jumped, nearly dropping the book. Her heart raced as she scrambled up the stairs, the flashlight beam darting wildly. When she reached the main floor, the living room window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the storm. She hadn't opened it, and in the corner of the room, just out of the flashlight's reach, a shadow moved. It wasn't alone. Laura's breath hitched as she froze in place, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The shadows in the corner seemed to ripple, like ink spreading through water. She wanted to call out, demand to know who, or what, was there, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she took a cautious step back, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The air felt heavier now, thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy. Then the shadow moved again, this time closer. Laura's instincts kicked in. She turned and bolted for the front door, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically as she ran. She fumbled with the lock, her fingers slipping on the damp brass. When the door finally creaked open, the storm outside greeted her with a blast of cold, rain-soaked wind. She stepped onto the porch, gasping for air, but the oppressive feeling didn't fade. It was out there with her. The rain pelted her face as she stumbled to her car, her shoes slipping on the slick wooden steps. She reached the sedan and yanked the door handle, only to find it locked. "Damn it," she hissed, fumbling through her bag for the keys. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal just as another sound reached her ears. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, squelching in the muddy driveway behind her. She froze, every muscle in her body tensed. The footsteps stopped. Laura didn't dare turn around. She jammed the key into the lock and yanked the door open, sliding into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut behind her. Her hands shook as she shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. Relief washed over her as she gripped the wheel, ready to reverse down the driveway. But something moved in her peripheral vision, in the passenger seat. She screamed and turned, her flashlight aimed at the empty space beside her. Empty. There was nothing there but the rain streaming down the windows. Her breathing was ragged as she forced herself to focus. She threw the car into reverse, the tires skidding on the muddy ground, and backed down the long, winding driveway. The house disappeared into the fog behind her, but the feeling of unease clung to her like a second skin. When she reached the main road, she hit the brakes and sat there, hands gripping the wheel, heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't go back to town, not in this state. But she couldn't stay out here either. She glanced at the clock. 12:24 a.m. The lawyer's instructions echoed in her mind. The inventory process will require an overnight stay. Please ensure all items are accounted for before vacating the premises. Hell no, she muttered. But she knew she didn't have a choice. It took her another 10 minutes to summon the courage to turn the car around. The drive back up the hill felt longer this time, every shadow in the trees seeming to stretch and reach for the vehicle as she passed. When she finally pulled up to the house again, it looked even darker, more menacing than before. She sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the front door. Part of her wanted to drive away and never look back. But the letter in her bag, and the memories of her mother's hollow, pleading eyes in her final days, kept her rooted. She couldn't leave. Not yet. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and into the rain. Inside, the house was colder than before. The wind howled through the open window in the living room, scattering leaves across the floor. Laura closed and latched the window, then turned to face the room. The shadows were still there, lurking at the edges of the flashlight's beam, but she forced herself to ignore them. She needed answers. The book was still on the floor where she dropped it. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against the worn leather cover. The warning on the first page lingered in her mind. The hollow does not forgive, and it never forgets. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the faded text. Most of it was illegible, written in a strange, looping script that seemed to shift and blur the longer she looked at it. But one passage stood out, the words clearer than the rest. The watcher in the dark sees all. To awaken its gaze is to invite its wrath. Her stomach turned. The watcher. The figure in the photograph. A chill ran down her spine as a new thought occurred to her. The photo hadn't been there when she first arrived. Someone, or something, had put it there. The sound of creaking floorboards above her made her jump. She spun around, flashlight aimed at the staircase leading to the second floor. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. The sound came again, louder this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth. Laura's mouth went dry as she took a cautious step toward the stairs. Her flashlight beam trembled as she aimed it upward, illuminating the narrow wooden steps. The footsteps stopped. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to go up there. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around and run, but something pulled her forward. The upstairs hallway was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and something else, something metallic and sharp. What? Her stomach churned as she moved down the hall, the flashlight beam darting from door to door. Most of them were closed, but one stood ajar at the end of the hall. The master bedroom. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a room frozen in time. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets, and the walls were lined with faded photographs. Her flashlight caught something on the floor. A trail of muddy footprints, leading from the window to the bed. Her gaze followed the trail and her heart stopped. Someone was sitting on the edge of the bed, their back to her. The figure was hunched over, their head tilted at an unnatural angle. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she took a cautious step back. The floorboard creaked beneath her foot. The figure moved. Its head twisted slowly, impossibly far, until its hollow eyes locked onto hers. And it smiled. The smile wasn't human. The figure's lips stretched far too wide, the skin around its mouth splitting as though it had been forced into the grotesque expression. Those hollow eyes bore into Laura, unblinking and endless, like twin voids threatening to consume her. Her muscles froze as if an invisible weight pressed her into place. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. The figure rose from the bed, its movements unnaturally fluid, as if it floated rather than walked. The sound of wet, squelching footsteps echoed as it moved closer, though its feet never touched the floor. Laura's heart hammered against her ribs. The flashlight slipped from her trembling hand and hit the ground, the beam flickering wildly as it spun in a slow circle. "W, what do you want?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The thing tilted its head, the motion so sharp and sudden that it made her flinch. Then it spoke, not in words, but in a low, guttural sound that seemed to reverberate inside her skull. The noise grew louder, like the hum of a distant swarm, until she clapped her hands over her ears in a futile attempt to block it out. And just like that, it was gone. The figure, the sound, the oppressive weight, it vanished as though it had never been there. The flashlight flickered one last time before plunging her into darkness. "No, no, no," Laura muttered, fumbling to pick it up. Her shaking hands managed to flip the switch, but the light refused to come back on. A soft click echoed behind her. She turned toward the sound, squinting into the shadows. Her eyes struggled to adjust, but she could make out the faint outline of the door at the end of the hall. It was wide open. Laura's pulse quickened. She could have sworn that door had been closed when she'd come upstairs. "Get a grip," she whispered to herself. "You're imagining things. That's all." But the rationalization felt hollow even to her. The metallic scent of blood lingered in the air, growing stronger with each passing moment. She covered her nose and mouth with her sleeve, her eyes watering as she took a cautious step toward the stairs. She needed to get out of this house. The staircase groaned under her weight as she descended, each creak echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling and rain lashing against the windows. When she reached the bottom, the living room seemed different. The furniture was slightly out of place, the angles just wrong enough to unsettle her. A chair was turned toward the window as though someone had been sitting there, watching the storm. But the most disturbing change was the book. It now sat open on the coffee table, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. Laura approached it cautiously, her pulse thundering in her ears. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from the bedroom standing behind her, but the room was empty. The text on the book's pages seemed to shimmer and shift, the words rearranging themselves before her eyes. A single sentence emerged, bold and clear. "You cannot leave." Laura's stomach turned. She slammed the book shut and backed away, her hands trembling. The front door was only a few steps away. She grabbed her bag, fumbled with the lock, and yanked the door open, determined to escape. But what greeted her outside made her blood run cold. The driveway was gone. In its place was an endless forest, the trees twisting and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Fog clung to the ground, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The car was nowhere to be seen. "No," she whispered, stepping onto the porch. "This isn't real. It can't be real." She turned back to the house, hoping to find some semblance of normalcy inside. But the door slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating through the empty halls. The lock clicked. Laura rattled the doorknob, her panic mounting. "Let me out," she screamed, pounding on the door. A low chuckle echoed from somewhere deep within the house. She spun around, pressing her back against the door, her eyes darting to every shadowy corner. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The chuckle grew louder, morphing into a distorted, inhuman laugh that sent chills racing down her spine. She spotted movement out of the corner of her eye, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, shrouded in darkness. This one was different. Smaller, almost childlike, but just as unsettling. Its head was tilted, and its arms hung limply at its sides. Laura's breath caught in her throat as it took a step forward, the dim light catching its face. It was a little girl. Or at least it had been once. Her skin was pale and mottled, her eyes sunken and lifeless. She wore a tattered dress stained with something dark and dried. "Why are you here?" the girl asked, her voice a hollow whisper. Laura couldn't answer. She pressed herself harder against the door, willing it to open, to let her escape. The girl tilted her head further, an eerie smile creeping across her cracked lips. "You shouldn't have come back." Before Laura could react, the girl lunged forward, moving impossibly fast. Laura screamed and ducked, scrambling away as the girl's claw-like fingers swiped through the air where her head had been. She didn't stop to look back. She ran down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold, wooden floor. The house seemed to shift around her, the walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering, until it felt like she was running through a tunnel. The girl's laughter followed her, echoing and overlapping as if it came from everywhere at once. Laura burst into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind her. She braced herself against it, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. But the room offered no safety. The cabinets rattled, their doors creaking open and shut. The faucet turned on by itself, the water running red as blood. And then she saw the writing on the wall. It hadn't been there before, but now it was impossible to ignore. Scrawled in what looked like dried blood were the words, "The Watcher is always watching." Laura sank to the floor, her back pressed against the door. She felt like she was drowning, the weight of the house pressing down on her from all sides. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the wall, the words seared into her mind. Then, from the other side of the door, came a soft knock. Tap, tap, tap. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her ears. Another knock, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. "Laura," a voice whispered. It was the girl, her tone sing-song and mocking. Laura clamped her hands over her ears, shaking her head. "Leave me alone." The door rattled as if something heavy had slammed against it. Then came silence. Laura didn't dare move. She stayed pressed against the door, every muscle in her body tense, waiting for the next attack. But the only sound was the steady drip of the faucet. After what felt like an eternity, she forced herself to stand. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she steadied herself on the counter. She had to find a way out. Her gaze fell on the kitchen window. It was small, but it might be her only chance. She grabbed a chair and climbed onto it, fumbling with the latch. But when she pushed it open, she was greeted by another impossibility. Instead of the stormy night outside, the window revealed a void, an endless expanse of darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. And in that darkness, something moved. Two glowing eyes stared back at her. The eyes in the void blinked, slow, deliberate. Laura froze, her fingers gripping the window frame so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She couldn't look away no matter how much she wanted to. The gaze held her captive, pulling her deeper into its endless, unknowable depths. "Close it," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "Close the window." But her body refused to cooperate. Her arms locked in place as if under someone else's control. The eyes moved closer, and for the first time she could see something else, something vast and twisted, coiling behind them. A sharp, metallic screech filled the air, and the glass began to crack. The fractures spread like spider webs, each one accompanied by a high-pitched whine that set her teeth on edge. With a surge of desperation, Laura yanked her hands free and slammed the window shut just as the glass shattered. She stumbled back, falling off the chair and landing hard on the kitchen floor. For a moment, she just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. And then she heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. The sound sent a chill racing down her spine. She forced herself to her feet, clutching the edge of the counter for support. The window was whole again, as if it had never cracked. But the tapping continued, steady and insistent. "Stop it," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. The tapping paused. Then a voice came from the other side of the glass, low and guttural. "Let me in." Laura stumbled back, shaking her head. No, I won't." The voice laughed, a deep, echoing sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You already did," it said. The lights in the kitchen flickered, and for a brief moment she saw a shadow standing in the doorway. When the lights came back on, it was gone. Laura's survival instincts kicked in. She grabbed the largest knife she could find from the counter and backed into the corner of the room. She couldn't stay here. The house, the things inside it, none of it made sense. She needed to leave. Gathering her courage, she bolted for the hallway. The house felt different now, its walls pulsing as if alive. Shadows danced along the edges of her vision, and the air grew colder with each step she took. As she approached the front door, it flung open on its own, revealing the forest outside. The fog had thickened, swirling like smoke. "Don't go," a voice whispered, soft and mournful. Laura hesitated, her hand hovering over the threshold. She didn't recognize the voice, but something about it felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream. "You'll be lost forever," the voice continued. But staying in the house felt worse than stepping into the unknown. She braced herself and ran out into the night. The cold hit her like a physical force, biting through her clothes and seeping into her skin. The forest loomed around her, the twisted trees forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Her footsteps crunched against the damp ground as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The fog wrapped around her, thick and suffocating, but she pushed forward, desperate to put as much distance as possible between herself and the house. The laughter started again, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. There wasn't just one voice now. It was many, overlapping and echoing, as if the forest itself was mocking her. "You can't escape," they whispered. "You belong here." "No," Laura shouted, covering her ears. "Leave me alone." But the voices didn't stop. Ahead, she saw a faint light flickering through the trees. She stumbled toward it, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. When she broke through the underbrush, she found herself standing in front of another house. It was identical to the one she had just fled. The same weathered facade, the same broken shutters, even the same porch light flickering weakly against the darkness. "No," she whispered, taking a step back. "This isn't real." But her retreat was halted by the sound of a door creaking open behind her. She turned slowly, her stomach churning with fear. The original house stood there, just a few feet away, its door swinging gently in the wind. She was trapped. Laura's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, her knife falling from her hand. She buried her face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice breaking. The laughter stopped. The forest fell silent, the oppressive stillness almost worse than the noise. Then a single voice spoke, calm and measured. "Remember?" Laura looked up, her tear-streaked face contorted with confusion. "What are you talking about?" "Remember why you're here," the voice said. And suddenly she did. The memories hit her like a tidal wave, overwhelming and disorienting. She saw herself standing in a hospital room, holding the hand of a pale, lifeless figure. Her sister Emily. The grief was still fresh, raw and aching, even though it had been years. She had promised Emily she would find a way to fix things, to make it all right again. But she had failed. Laura's chest tightened as she recalled the book, the one she had found in a dusty antique store shortly after Emily's death. The book that claimed to hold secrets of life and death. She had read it cover to cover, desperate for answers. And when the final page had warned of a price to be paid, she hadn't cared. Anything to bring Emily back. Now, standing between the two identical houses, Laura realized the truth. She hadn't stumbled upon this place by accident. She had been drawn here, lured by the promise of undoing her past mistakes. But the price was far greater than she had imagined. The voice spoke again, softer this time. "You opened the door." The words chilled her to the bone. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. The voice laughed, low and cruel. "Intentions don't matter. Only actions." The fog began to close in, the trees twisting and contorting as though they were alive. Shadows emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes and twisted smiles eerily familiar. They were all the same figures she had seen in the bedroom, multiplied and distorted. And they were coming for her. Laura scrambled to her feet, grabbing the knife and holding it in front of her. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice cracking. The shadows didn't stop. They moved as one, their collective laughter growing louder and more chaotic. Panicking, Laura turned and ran toward one of the houses. She didn't care which one anymore, she just needed to get away. She slammed the door shut behind her and locked it, her back pressed against the wood as she struggled to catch her breath. But the house was no refuge. The walls pulsed with a sickly light, and the shadows crept under the door, pooling at her feet. From the corner of the room, a voice whispered, "You can't run from yourself." The voice echoed through the room, soft yet unnervingly clear, as though it had been spoken directly into her mind. "You can't run from yourself?" Laura froze, the knife trembling in her grip. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and the shadows pooled at her feet began to writhe, snaking upward like black tendrils reaching for her. "No," she whispered, backing away. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The laughter returned, low and guttural, growing louder and more chaotic as it filled the room. The shadows crept closer, their edges sharp and jagged, and the walls of the house seemed to close in, bending unnaturally as though the space itself were alive. Laura turned and bolted down the hallway, her footsteps echoing like gunshots in the oppressive silence. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against her chest and making it harder to breathe. She reached the living room and skidded to a stop. The fireplace was roaring, though she hadn't lit it, and in the flames she saw something that made her stomach drop. It was her. The figure in the flames wore her face, but its expression was twisted, its eyes hollow and filled with malice. It smiled at her, a slow, deliberate grin that sent a wave of nausea rolling through her. "Why are you doing this to me?" Laura shouted, her voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, its grin widening. "Because you called me?" The shadows behind her surged forward, forcing her closer to the fireplace. The heat was unbearable, but she couldn't move away. Her legs felt like lead rooted to the spot. "You wanted to bring her back," the figure said, its voice blending with the crackling of the flames. "You were willing to do anything. Remember?" Laura's mind raced, fragments of memories flashing before her eyes. The book, the ritual, the promise. "I didn't know," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know it would be like this." The figure's laughter was cold and hollow. "Ignorance doesn't absolve you." The flames exploded outward, and Laura was thrown backward, landing hard on the floor. The knife skidded out of her hand, disappearing into the shadows that now covered the room like a living carpet. She scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding, and made a run for the staircase. If she could get to the second floor, maybe she could find a way out. Another window, a hidden door, anything. The stairs groaned under her weight as she climbed, the sound echoing like a scream. Behind her, the shadows surged upward, flowing like water, their jagged edges slicing through the wooden banister as they ascended. Reaching the top, Laura darted into the first room she saw and slammed the door shut, shoving a dresser against it for good measure. The room was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of mildew. She fumbled for a light switch, her fingers shaking, and when the bulb flickered to life, she wished it hadn't. The walls were covered in writing. Words scrawled in dark, jagged letters repeating over and over. You can't escape. You open the door. You let it in. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the room. In the corner stood a mirror, tall and ornate, its surface tarnished and cracked. She approached it cautiously, her reflection dim and distorted. But as she got closer, she realized something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't mirroring her movements. It stood perfectly still, its hollow eyes locked on hers, and then it smiled, a slow, chilling grin that made her blood run cold. The reflection raised a hand and pointed at the writing on the wall. Laura turned, her heart racing, and saw that one line had changed. The price must be paid. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I didn't mean for this. I just wanted to fix things. I just wanted her back. The mirror cracked, the sound sharp and piercing, and when she looked back, her reflection was gone. The shadows outside the door began to pound against it, the dresser trembling with each impact. Laura backed away, her pulse hammering in her ears. From somewhere deep within the house, she heard the voice again, calm and steady. Remember the terms? The door burst open, and the shadows poured into the room, swirling around her in a chaotic vortex. She screamed, her voice drowned out by the deafening roar. And then everything went silent. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the room. She was standing in the middle of the forest, the fog swirling around her. The house was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of twisted trees and gnarled roots. But she wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the fog, its features obscured. It was tall and thin, its movements unnaturally fluid as it approached. Who are you? Laura demanded, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It simply pointed at her, and as it did, she felt a searing pain in her chest. She looked down and saw a symbol carved into her skin, glowing faintly in the dim light. The figure's voice was a low whisper, barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. You made a deal, it said. And now you must fulfill it. Laura shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know. I didn't understand. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, and placed a cold, skeletal hand on her shoulder. You can't escape your choices, it said. The debt must be paid. The ground beneath her began to shift, the roots twisting and coiling around her feet. She struggled, but they held her fast, pulling her down into the earth. No, she screamed, clawing at the dirt as it swallowed her. Please no. The last thing she saw was the figure's hollow eyes, staring down at her with an expression that might have been pity or satisfaction. Laura woke with a gasp, her body drenched in sweat. She was back in the house, lying on the living room floor. The knife was in her hand, and the fireplace was dark and cold. For a moment, she thought it had all been a nightmare. But then she saw the symbol on her chest, faint but unmistakable, and she knew the truth. The house wasn't done with her, and neither was the thing she had summoned. Laura sat frozen on the cold wooden floor, her eyes fixed on the faintly glowing symbol carved into her chest. Her mind raced, replaying every moment of the nightmare, or was it reality? The house was quiet now, eerily so, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Her hands trembled as she clutched the knife, its weight unfamiliar and unsettling. The memory of the figure's hollow eyes and its ominous words echoed in her mind. The debt must be paid. She shivered, the air around her colder than it should have been. Slowly, she got to her feet, her legs unsteady, and turned to the fireplace. The logs were cold and untouched, as though no fire had ever burned there. Her gaze drifted upward to the mantel. There, in the center, sat something that hadn't been there before. A small black book with a worn leather cover. Laura hesitated, her heart pounding. The book radiated a strange energy as if it were alive. Her instincts screamed at her to leave it alone, but something, curiosity, desperation, or maybe the influence of the house, drove her forward. She reached out and picked it up, the leather warm and almost pulsing beneath her fingertips. The cover was blank, but when she opened it, she saw the same jagged writing that covered the walls of the upstairs room. You can't escape. You open the door. You let it in. The pages flipped on their own, faster and faster, until they stopped on a blank page. Slowly, words began to appear, written in dark, spidery ink. The truth lies beneath. Her brow furrowed. Beneath what? She whispered. As if in response, the floor beneath her feet creaked loudly. Laura's eyes darted downward. The floorboards looked ordinary enough, but the creaking grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to vibrate through her entire body. She crouched down and ran her fingers along the edges of the boards. One of them was loose. Taking a deep breath, she wedged the tip of the knife under the edge and pried it up. The board came free with a groan, revealing a dark, narrow crawlspace beneath. The air that seeped out was damp and foul, carrying the scent of decay. She hesitated, peering into the darkness. A faint glimmer caught her eye, something metallic reflecting the dim light of the room. Gripping the knife tightly, she reached into the crawlspace. Her fingers brushed against cold metal, and she pulled out an object wrapped in a tattered, blood-stained cloth. Unwrapping it carefully, she found a small, ornate key, its surface etched with strange, twisting symbols. The sight of it sent a chill down her spine. "What do you open?" she muttered under her breath, turning the key over in her hands. The house seemed to answer. A low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls and floor. It was coming from somewhere below. She stood, her legs shaky, and scanned the room. There was no visible way to go further down, but the sound was undeniable, a pulsing, otherworldly rhythm that seemed to draw her closer. Clutching the knife and the key, she followed the sound, her every step echoing in the oppressive silence. The humming led her to the back of the house, where a narrow, sagging door stood slightly ajar. She hesitated, her pulse quickening, then pushed it open. The door led to a staircase, spiraling down into the darkness. The air grew colder with each step, and the scent of damp earth and rot grew stronger. She reached the bottom and found herself in a small, stone-walled room. The walls were covered in the same jagged writing, but this time, the words were interspersed with symbols, twisting, intricate designs that seemed to writhe and shift when she looked at them. In the center of the room was a heavy, iron-bound chest. The humming grew louder as she approached, the key in her hand growing warmer. Her fingers trembled as she inserted it into the lock. The chest opened with a sharp, metallic snap. Inside was a bundle of photographs, yellowed with age. She picked them up, her hands shaking, and began to sift through them. The first few were blurry, their edges burned, but she recognized the house. The images showed it in various states of decay, as though documenting its gradual descent into ruin. Then she froze. The next photo was of a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl, their faces turned toward the camera. The girl's face was blurred, as though the image had been deliberately scratched away. Her stomach churned as she flipped to the next photo. It was the same family, but this time the little girl was missing. The parents stood alone, their faces twisted into expressions of grief and despair. The final photo sent a jolt of icy dread through her. It was of her. The image showed her standing in the living room of the house, clutching the same knife she now held. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, as though she were looking at something just out of frame. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The shadows in the room began to shift, pooling around her feet. The writing on the walls glowed faintly, the symbols pulsing in time with her racing heartbeat. From the corner of the room, a figure emerged. It was the same figure from the forest, tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness. "You've seen the truth," it said, its voice a low, resonant whisper. "Now you must face it." Laura stumbled back, the photograph slipping from her hands. "What truth? What do you want from me?" The figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. "This house is a door," it said. "You opened it. And now you must decide what comes through." The walls began to shake, the symbols glowing brighter. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around her legs and pulling her toward the figure. Laura struggled, her screams echoing in the confined space. "No, I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The figure tilted its head, its expression unreadable. "Ignorance does not absolve you. The choice is yours." The shadows pulled her closer, and the figure reached out, its skeletal hand brushing against her forehead. In an instant, her mind was flooded with images, flashes of the family from the photographs, the little girl's laughter, the parents' grief, and the dark ritual that had bound the house to something far older and more malevolent than she could comprehend. The last image was of herself, standing before the chest, the key in her hand. Laura gasped, the visions fading as the figure withdrew its hand. The shadows loosened their grip, retreating into the corners of the room. The figure's voice was softer now, almost gentle. "Decide, Laura. What will you let in?" She stood trembling, her mind racing. The knife felt heavy in her hand, the key still warm against her palm. The chest lay open at her feet, its contents a grim reminder of the house's history, and her role in it. Her gaze drifted to the photographs scattered across the floor, her own terrified face staring back at her. She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happens if I don't choose?" The figure's hollow eyes seemed to glint with something that might have been amusement or malice. "You've already chosen," it said, and then the room went dark. When Laura's vision returned, she was no longer in the stone-walled room. She was back in the living room, the photographs gone, the knife and key still clutched tightly in her hands. The house was unnaturally quiet, the silence oppressive. Her breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The figure's words echoed in her mind. "You've already chosen." She looked around, expecting to see the dark figure lurking in the shadows, but the room appeared empty. The oppressive energy that had hung heavy in the air earlier now seemed even thicker, pressing against her like an invisible weight. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from upstairs. Laura hesitated, her legs trembling, but something compelled her to move. She ascended the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath her weight. The sound grew louder as she climbed, a deliberate tapping that sent chills racing down her spine. At the top of the stairs, she froze. The door to the master bedroom was ajar, and the sound was coming from inside, the room she had sworn to avoid. She gripped the knife tightly, its blade catching the dim light, and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as she had left it, the walls covered in jagged writing, the air thick with the scent of mildew. But now, in the center of the room, a rocking chair moved back and forth, its motion slow and deliberate. Sitting in the chair was a doll. It was an old-fashioned porcelain doll, its face cracked, its glass eyes staring blankly ahead. Its hands rested on its lap, clutching something small and dark. Laura took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding. The doll's head tilted slightly as though it were watching her. What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The doll's grip loosened, and the object in its hands fell to the floor with a soft thud. It was a photograph, faded and yellowed with age. Laura bent down to pick it up, her hands shaking. The image showed a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of the house. Her face was eerily familiar. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. It was her. The room began to spin, the walls seeming to close in around her. The writing on the walls glowed faintly, the jagged lines pulsing like veins. She stumbled back, clutching the photograph to her chest. "This isn't real," she muttered, her voice trembling. "It can't be real." The rocking chair creaked louder, its motion growing more erratic. The doll's head tilted further, its cracked face splitting into what almost looked like a smile. A whisper filled the room, soft and insidious. "She called you back." Laura turned, her pulse racing. Who called me back?" The whisper grew louder, overlapping voices filling her ears until she could barely think. "She called you back to finish what she started." Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The rocking chair stilled, the doll's head drooping forward as though it had gone lifeless. Laura stumbled out of the room, her breath coming in panicked gasps. The photograph felt hot in her hand, the image of her younger self burned into her mind. She fled down the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. The living room felt even darker than before, the shadows deeper and more menacing. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, the front door creaked open on its own. A cold wind blew through the house, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Laura hesitated, torn between the instinct to run and the strange pull that kept her rooted to the spot. She stepped outside, the wind whipping her hair around her face. The fog had thickened, swallowing the surrounding trees and leaving her feeling even more isolated. The path leading away from the house was barely visible, but she could make out faint footprints in the dirt. Small footprints like those of a child. Her breath caught in her throat. She followed the prints, her footsteps hesitant. The trail led her to the edge of the forest, where a clearing opened up before her. In the center of the clearing stood a solitary tree, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. Beneath the tree was a small grave, marked with a simple wooden cross. Laura approached the grave slowly, her heart pounding. The earth around it looked disturbed, as though it had been dug up recently. She crouched down, her fingers brushing against the wooden cross. Carved into its surface was a name, Margaret Ellis. The name sent a jolt of recognition through her. It was her mother's maiden name. Before she could process the revelation, the ground beneath her shifted. The earth cracked and split, and a skeletal hand emerged from the grave, its fingers clawing at the air. Laura screamed, stumbling backward as the hand reached for her. The shadows around the tree seemed to come alive, swirling and writhing like a living entity. From the darkness, a figure emerged, a little girl, her face pale and lifeless, her eyes dark pits of emptiness. The girl tilted her head, her gaze fixed on Laura. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered, her voice carrying a note of sadness and accusation. I don't understand," Laura stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't." The girl stepped closer, her movements unnaturally smooth. "You left me here. You forgot about me. But I didn't forget about you." Tears streamed down Laura's face as the memories flooded back. Memories she had buried deep, too painful to confront. The little girl wasn't just a ghost. She was her sister. The revelation hit her like a tidal wave. She remembered the day her family had come to this house years ago to escape the pain of losing Margaret. She remembered her parents' hushed whispers, their refusal to talk about what had happened. But she had blocked out the most important memory, the day she had wandered into the woods with Margaret, leaving her behind when the shadows had come. "I didn't mean to," Laura sobbed, her voice cracking. "I was scared. I didn't know." The girl's expression softened, but the darkness around her only grew thicker. "It doesn't matter," she said. "The house remembers. And now it's your turn." The shadows surged forward, swallowing the clearing in an instant. Laura screamed as the darkness enveloped her, pulling her back toward the house. The last thing she saw before the world went black was her sister's face, watching her with a mix of sorrow and something far more sinister. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the living room, the photograph still clutched in her hand. The house was alive around her, the walls pulsing with dark energy. She knew then that there was no escaping the house, no undoing what had been done. The debt had to be paid, and it was her turn to pay it. Laura woke to the sound of thunder shaking the walls of the house. The storm outside was relentless, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the cracks. Her body ached, and her mind felt foggy, as though she'd been submerged in a nightmare she couldn't escape. She was still clutching the photograph of her younger self, the edges worn and damp with sweat. The house seemed quieter now, but the oppressive weight of its presence was stronger than ever. The whispers started again, faint at first, then growing louder. They were coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in her head. "Finish it. Finish it." Laura stood, her legs shaky but resolute. She had no idea what the whispers wanted, but she knew there was no escape. This wasn't about running anymore. It was about confronting the truth. She gripped the knife tightly and made her way to the master bedroom, the air growing colder with each step. The door was wide open, the rocking chair empty. The doll was gone. The writing on the walls had changed. It now spelled out a single phrase repeated over and over. "The past cannot be buried." In the center of the room, where the rocking chair had been, was a trapdoor she hadn't noticed before. Its edges were outlined with faint, glowing light, as though something below was alive. Laura hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she forced herself to move forward. She knelt and pulled the trapdoor open, revealing a set of narrow stairs descending into darkness. The air below was damp and heavy, carrying the faint stench of decay. She descended slowly, the knife trembling in her hand. The glow grew brighter as she moved deeper, illuminating the walls of a narrow, earthen tunnel. At the end of the tunnel was a cavern, its walls lined with jagged stones and strange, ancient symbols carved into the surface. In the center of the cavern was a stone altar, and on the altar lay the doll. Its eyes were open now, glinting with a malevolent light. Behind the altar, shadows began to coalesce, forming the figure she had seen before. The dark entity loomed over the doll, its presence suffocating. "Why me?" Laura whispered, her voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The entity's voice echoed through the cavern, low and resonant. "This house is a memory and you are its keeper. You brought the past with you. You awakened me." Laura felt her knees buckle, but she forced herself to stay upright. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The entity moved closer, its form shifting and rippling like smoke. "You cannot escape the truth. It binds you to this place." The doll on the altar shifted, its porcelain hand reaching toward Laura. A voice, soft and childlike, came from its cracked lips. "Do you remember, Laura? Do you remember what you did?" Images flooded her mind. Her younger self running through the woods, her sister's cries for help as the shadows descended, the overwhelming fear that had made her leave Margaret behind. "I was just a kid," Laura screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know what was happening." The shadows around the entity grew darker, swirling like a vortex. "But you ran, and you let her fall." The ground beneath her began to shake, the walls of the cavern trembling as the symbols glowed brighter. The doll's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment she saw Margaret's face and its cracked features. "You left me," the doll said, its voice filled with sorrow. "But now you can stay with me forever." Laura felt the shadows closing in, pressing against her from all sides. The photograph in her hand burst into flames, the image of her younger self consumed by fire. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. The house wasn't just a place, it was alive, a living memory of everything she had tried to forget. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices chanting in a language she couldn't understand. The entity raised its hand, and the cavern seemed to collapse inward, the darkness swallowing everything. Laura screamed, her voice lost in the cacophony. For a brief moment, she felt herself falling, her body weightless in the void. Then everything went silent. She opened her eyes to find herself back in the living room, sitting in the rocking chair. The house was quiet now, the oppressive energy gone. The photograph was gone, the knife no longer in her hand. The walls were blank, free of the jagged writing. But something was wrong. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, almost sentient. And in the mirror above the fireplace, Laura didn't see her own reflection. She saw Margaret, her face pale and lifeless, her eyes dark pits of emptiness. Margaret smiled. Laura tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her legs rooted to the chair. The realization hit her like a cold wave. She wasn't in control anymore. The whispers returned, faint and mocking. "The house keeps what it's owed." In the mirror, Margaret stepped forward, her movements smooth and deliberate. She reached out a hand, and Laura felt her own arm lift against her will. The doll's voice echoed in her mind. "You're part of the house now." The front door creaked open, and a cold wind blew through the room. Outside, the fog had cleared, and the forest was quiet. But Laura knew she would never leave. She was bound to the house, just as Margaret had been. The rocking chair began to move, its motion slow and deliberate. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of footsteps approaching the house. Someone was coming. Laura's lips curled into a smile that wasn't her own. The house was ready for its next guest. The end.